Hi there, thanks for joining me tonight. We're going to talk about how regular people long ago made it through cold winters. Back then, families in small villages like Warren Percy had to get ready for winter by working together day after day. We'll learn about how they stored food to last for months, how they made warm clothes from sheep's wool, and how they used simple candles and firelight in their small homes during the long, dark evenings. This isn't about kings or battles. It's about normal people just trying to stay warm and fed during winter, using skills they learned from their parents and grandparents. If these calm history stories help you relax, feel free to subscribe. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Just leave a comment below if you'd like to share. Now get comfy, maybe turn down your lights, and let's drift back to a simpler time, when getting through winter meant working together, being patient, and following the rhythm of the seasons. In a small village called Warren Percy in England, about 800 years ago, getting ready for winter was a big deal. There were no grocery stores or refrigerators back then. When the days started getting shorter in September, everyone in the village got busy preparing for the cold months ahead. Saving food wasn't just something nice to do, it was how you stayed alive when snow covered the ground and nothing would grow. The ways they kept food from spoiling might seem simple, but they worked really well, and people had been using these methods for hundreds of years. Let's talk about grain first, things like wheat, rye, barley, and oats. These were the most important foods for people back then. By the end of summer, around late August, everyone worked together to cut down all the grain crops. Then they had to make sure the grain would stay good all winter long. First, they dried the grain really well by spreading it out where air could move around it. After it was dry, they put it in big wooden boxes or clay pots. Some villages even had special buildings called granaries built up off the ground, so mice and rats couldn't easily get in. The granaries had another clever trick. They were made so air could flow through without letting in rain or snow. This kept the grain from getting damp and moldy. Sometimes they mixed the grain with certain leaves that naturally kept bugs away. Bread was the main food for most people. A family might eat 2 or 3 pounds of bread every day, but they couldn't bake bread once a week like we might do today. Baking used up a lot of valuable firewood. Instead, they made dense, hard loaves that would last a long time without going bad. These weren't the soft, fluffy loaves we enjoy today. Medieval bread was often dark, heavy, and very dense. The darker the bread, the poorer the family usually. White bread was for rich people because it used the best parts of the wheat. Most peasants ate bread made from rye or a mix of grains. But people couldn't live on bread alone. They needed to store fruits and vegetables too. In the late summer and early fall, women and children picked as many berries as they could find. They dried apples and pears by cutting them into thin slices and hanging them near the fire or in the sun. Once dried, these fruits would keep for months. Root vegetables, like carrots, turnips, and beets, were easier to store. Peasants dug simple root cellars, cool, dark spaces under or near their homes, where they kept these vegetables in boxes of sand. The sand kept the right amount of moisture and stopped the vegetables from rotting too quickly. Cabbage was really important in winter. They would pick the cabbage heads and bury them in the ground, where the soil kept them at a steady temperature. Or they might make sauerkraut by cutting cabbage into thin strips, adding salt, and letting it ferment in barrels. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage, but also created a food rich in nutrients that helped prevent winter illnesses. Meat was trickier to keep fresh. Most families couldn't afford to eat meat regularly, but when they did have some, they needed ways to make it last. They didn't keep many animals through winter because feeding them was too expensive. Instead, they slaughtered most animals in late fall. The most common way to preserve meat was salting. They would rub pieces of meat with lots of salt, which drew out moisture and stopped bacteria from growing. They also smoked meat by hanging it over a fire for many days. The smoke flavored the meat while drying it out and leaving chemicals that kept it from spoiling. For special occasions or wealthier peasants, honey was used as a preservative. Its natural properties prevent bacteria growth. and meats preserved in honey stayed moist and flavorful. But honey was expensive, so this wasn't common. Fish played a big part in their diet too, especially during religious times like Lent, when Christians weren't supposed to eat meat. People would catch fish from rivers and lakes, then preserve them by drying, smoking, or salting. Near the coast, they made salt fish that could last for months if kept dry. But what about dairy? Milk spoils quickly, but medieval people had solutions for that too. They turned milk into cheese and butter that would last through winter. Making cheese used up almost all the milk from their cows and goats before winter came. Would you like to imagine the inside of a peasant's home in late October? The hanging bundles of dried herbs and onions from the low ceiling beams. The carefully stacked turnips and beets in the corner. The hard loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. The smoked meats hanging away from curious mice. Every bit of food carefully saved because no one knew how long winter might last or how hungry they might get before spring came again. As the first frost touched the ground outside, people in Warren Percy would look at their stored food with cautious hope. Would it be enough? Had they prepared well? Only time would tell if their preservation methods would see them through until the first green shoots of spring appeared again. What about the things they couldn't grow themselves, like salt for preserving foods? Where did medieval peasants get such important items when there were no stores as we know them today? Salt was one of the most valuable things a medieval family could own. Unlike today, when you can buy a big bag of salt for a few dollars, salt back then was expensive and sometimes hard to find, but they couldn't preserve food without it, so people had to find ways to get it. In some places along the coast, villagers would collect seawater and let it evaporate in shallow pans, leaving the salt behind. In other places, there were salt springs or salt mines. The salt from these places would be carried to villages by traders. These traders moved from village to village, sometimes following routes that had been used for hundreds of years. They didn't come very often to small villages like Warren Percy, maybe just a few times a year. So when they did arrive with their carts or pack animals, it was a big event. Families would save up to buy salt, or they might trade things they made or grew for it. Sometimes a whole village would pool their resources to buy salt in bulk, then share it among all the families. This is one way neighbors helped each other survive. Once they had salt, they had to make it last. They kept it in special containers to keep it dry. If salt got wet, it would dissolve and be wasted. A family might use different amounts of salt for different foods. They'd use more salt for foods they wanted to keep for a very long time, like winter meat, and less salt for foods they'd eat sooner. But storing food wasn't just about keeping it from spoiling. It was also about saving food for times when people couldn't work outside. In the middle of winter, when snow covered the fields and the ground was frozen solid, there wasn't much farming work to do. People had to rely on what they'd stored. Imagine the careful planning this took. Families had to think about how much food they would need for every day of winter. They had to guess how long winter might last. Would it be a short winter of just 3 months? Or would the cold hang on into April or even May? Getting this wrong could mean going hungry at the end of winter. One clever way people stretched their food supplies was by eating different things as winter went on. In early winter, they'd eat foods that wouldn't last as long in storage. As winter deepened, they'd move on to better preserved foods. By late winter, they might be eating their most heavily preserved foods, which didn't taste as good, but would keep them alive. They also changed how much they ate based on the work they were doing. In summer, when everyone worked hard in the fields from sunrise to sunset, they needed to eat more. In winter, when they weren't burning as many calories working, they might eat smaller meals. This wasn't dieting like we think of it today. It was carefully rationing food to make it last. Even with all this planning, late winter and early spring were often called the hungry time. This was when stored food started running low, but new crops weren't ready yet. During this time, people might eat just one meal a day. They might make soups with small amounts of ingredients stretched with water. They might forage in the woods for early spring plants before anything was growing in the fields. Children would be sent to find the first dandelion greens, or young nettles that poked through the snow. These plants didn't provide many calories, but they had vitamins that helped prevent people from getting sick after a winter of eating mostly preserved foods. Sometimes, during really bad winters or after poor harvests, people went hungry. We know from looking at bones from medieval times that many people didn't get enough good food, especially in late winter. Their bones show lines of arrested growth, times when they weren't getting enough nutrients and their bodies stopped growing, temporarily. But medieval people were also creative about finding food in unlikely places. They knew which tree bark could be ground into flour in emergencies. They knew which normally bitter acorns could be soaked to remove the bad taste and then ground into meal. Knowledge like this might save a family during the worst times. They also shared food when times were tough. If one family ran out, neighbors would help. They knew that next year, they might be the ones needing help. Villages survived by sticking together. Churches and monasteries sometimes helped feed people during the hungriest times. They collected a tax called a tithe, which meant 1/10 from everyone. Part of this food was supposed to go to helping the poor. In a very bad winter, a monastery might open its stores to feed hungry villagers. Special feast days broke up the monotony of winter eating. Christmas, New Year's, and other holidays were times when people might eat a little better, even in the middle of winter. They saved special foods for these occasions, maybe a bit of honey, some dried fruit, or even a piece of meat that had been carefully preserved for the celebration. By February, people in Warren Percy would be watching carefully for signs of spring. They looked for birds returning from their winter migrations. They checked the trees for the first buds. They hoped to see the ground thaw so they could start digging for wild roots again. And while they waited, they counted what food remained in their storage areas. Had they preserved enough? Would they make it through? And perhaps most importantly, what had they learned this winter that would help them prepare better next year? What about the actual work of preserving all this food? Who did it, and how did they find time for this huge task when they were also bringing in the harvest? The work of preserving food for winter wasn't something people did alone. It was a big job that brought whole families and sometimes entire villages together. This was especially true in the busy time of late summer and early fall, when crops were being harvested and gardens were full of vegetables. Women played a huge role in food preservation. While men were often in the fields bringing in the grain harvest, women took charge of processing and storing the food that would keep everyone alive through winter. Young children helped too, doing simple tasks like picking berries or shelling beans. On a typical day in September, a woman in Warren Percy might wake up before sunrise. She would restart the fire that had been banked overnight and begin her day's work while the rest of the household was still getting up. If it was a day for making cheese, she would first milk the family cow or goats. The milk would go into a wooden bucket, then be poured into special shallow pans. After adding a substance called rennet, which came from calves' stomachs, she would wait for the milk to separate into curds and whey. The curds would be pressed into cheese wheels of different sizes. Smaller cheeses were eaten sooner, while larger ones were coated in wax or cloth soaked in fat to seal them for longer storage. Whey, the liquid left over, wouldn't be wasted. It might be fed to pigs or used in cooking. On another day, her main job might be drying fruits. Children would have gathered apples, pears, or berries from the village's common areas or forest edges. She would slice the apples and pears thinly, thread them on strings, and hang them near the fire or outside in the sun if the weather was good. Berries would be spread on flat baskets to dry. Herbs for both cooking and medicine needed to be gathered, and dried too. Bundles of thyme, sage, rosemary, and other plants hung from ceiling beams. Once dry, they would be stored in pottery containers or cloth bags. Making sauerkraut or pickled vegetables was a bigger job that might bring several women together. They would gather with their cabbages, cucumbers, or other vegetables at one house. While their hands worked slicing cabbage or packing cucumbers into brine, they would talk and share stories. This made the work go faster and was one of the few social times women had during the busy harvest season. Sometimes a village might have a special day when everyone worked together on a big preservation task. After the slaughter of animals in late fall, for example, many hands were needed to process the meat quickly before it spoiled. Men would butcher the animals while women prepared the brine, salt rubs, or smoking fires. Children ran messages between work areas or helped with simple tasks. Older people who couldn't do heavy farm work anymore were still valuable during preservation time. They often knew the best recipes for pickles or the perfect timing for cheese making. Their years of experience helped ensure food would keep well through the winter. Time management was crucial during harvest season. Some preservation tasks couldn't wait, like dealing with fresh meat or milk, which would spoil quickly. Other tasks could be done a bit later, like drying already gathered herbs, or making preserves from fruits that had been picked a day or two before. Families had to balance field work with preservation work. Sometimes they would alternate days, one day in the fields, the next day processing food, or perhaps family members would split up, with some harvesting while others preserved. Weather added another challenge. Many preservation methods needed dry, sunny days. If it rained for a week during harvest time, people had to adapt quickly. Maybe they would focus on salt preservation instead of drying, or they might use more firewood than plan to dry things indoors. The work was hard and the days were long during this season. People often worked from dawn until after dark. But there was also satisfaction in seeing storage areas filling up with food that would keep families alive during the lean months ahead. By November, as the first real cold settled in, most of the preservation work was done. Root vegetables were in their sandboxes, dried fruits and herbs hung from rafters, cheeses were aging on shelves, and salted or smoked meats were stored safely away from pests. Now families could turn to indoor winter work, spinning wool, repairing tools, weaving baskets, and other tasks we'll learn about in later stories. The pace of life changed with the seasons, but food preservation was perhaps the most important work of the year. Without it, there would be no surviving until spring. Throughout winter, people would carefully use what they had preserved. They would check storage areas regularly, looking for any signs of spoilage. If a cheese showed mold, they might cut off the moldy part and eat the rest quickly. If a root vegetable started to soften, it would go into the cooking pot that day. By the time the first green shoots appeared in spring, many families' stores would be nearly empty. They would be ready for fresh food again, tender greens, new milk as animals had their babies, and eventually the first early garden vegetables. And soon after that, they would begin thinking about the next winter and how to preserve enough food once again. The cycle would continue, just as it had for hundreds of years before, and would for hundreds of years after. The knowledge of food preservation was passed down from mothers to daughters, from fathers to sons, and from village elders to younger generations. It wasn't written in books, but taught by doing, year after year. This practical knowledge was just as important as knowing how to grow crops or care for animals. And so the people of Warren Percy and thousands of other medieval villages survived winter after winter, not through modern technology, but through careful planning, hard work, and the wisdom gathered by generations before them. But food was just one part of surviving winter. How did medieval peasants stay warm when temperatures dropped below freezing? What did they wear when snow covered the ground and icy winds blew through their villages? When we think about staying warm in winter today, we might think about turning up the heat or putting on a thick coat we bought from a store. But for people living in medieval villages like the ones in Northern Europe, staying warm meant wearing clothes they made themselves, mostly from the wool of sheep. The story of a winter coat in medieval times didn't start at a store. It started with a sheep. Most villages kept flocks of sheep, not just for meat, but especially for their woolly coats. Each spring, when the weather turned warmer, villagers would gather for sheep shearing day. Shearing was usually done with simple iron clippers that looked a bit like large scissors. It took skill to cut the wool off without hurting the sheep, or cutting the wool into pieces that were too small to use. Men usually did the shearing, while women and children helped hold the sheep or collect the wool as it came off. A single sheep could provide enough wool for one person's winter clothes. though the exact amount depended on the size of the sheep and the thickness of its coat. Different types of sheep gave different qualities of wool, some softer, some coarser, some better for specific types of clothing. After shearing, the raw wool was very dirty. It had bits of grass, twigs, and dirt caught in it, as well as natural oils called lanolin. Before it could be made into yarn, the wool needed to be cleaned. Women would wash the wool in streams or large tubs using water and sometimes a kind of soap made from ash mixed with fat. They'd gently squeeze the wool in the water, being careful not to tangle or felt it, which would make it mat together. Then they'd lay it out on bushes or racks to dry in the sun. Once the wool was dry, it needed to be combed or carded. Carding straightened the fibers and removed any remaining bits of dirt or plant material. People used tools called cards, which looked like brushes with metal teeth. By pulling the wool between two cards, they made it ready for spinning. Spinning was one of the most time-consuming parts of making cloth. Using a tool called a drop spindle, a stick with a weighted end, women would carefully pull and twist small amounts of the carded wool, turning it into yarn. They could do this while walking, talking, or watching children, making use of small moments throughout their busy days. A good spinner could make yarn that was even and strong, perfect for weaving. But it took a lot of practice to get that good. Young girls started learning to spin when they were about 7 years old. By the time they were teenagers, most could spin without even looking at their hands. Later in the medieval period, spinning wheels became more common. These helped make yarn faster than drop spindles, but they were expensive, and not every family had one. In some villages, several families might share a spinning wheel. Can you imagine how much yarn was needed for winter clothes? For one person's set of winter clothes, a tunic, leggings, a cloak, and some head covering, a spinner would need to make about 1 mile of yarn. That could take weeks of spinning. A little bit each day between other chores. By late summer or early fall, with winter approaching, families would have large balls of yarn ready for the next step. Weaving. Weaving turned yarn into cloth using a loom. Simple looms could be set up in a cottage, while larger looms might be shared by the village. Weaving also took skill. The weaver had to keep the threads even and make sure the cloth was neither too tight nor too loose. A good piece of wool cloth was warm, somewhat water-resistant, thanks to the natural oils still in the wool, and would last for years. After, weaving came fulling, a process that made the cloth thicker and warmer. Fullers would pound the cloth while it was wet, often using their feet. This made the wool fibers mesh together more tightly. Some villages had special wooden tubs for fulling, while others did it by a stream. The cloth was then stretched on frames called tenters to dry without shrinking. Around a medieval village, you might see these frames set up outside cottages, with pieces of cloth drying on them, held tight by small hooks called tenterhooks. That's where we get the phrase on tenterhooks, meaning to be stretched tight, with worry or anticipation. Once the cloth was dry, it was ready to be made into clothing. Unlike today, medieval people didn't have many different outfits. A typical peasant might have just 2 sets of clothes, one for every day and one slightly better set for special occasions like church services. Winter clothing was layered. Men wore linen shirts next to their skin, then woolen tunics that reached to their knees, woolen leggings or loose pants, and wool cloaks fastened with a pin or brooch. Women wore linen shifts under woolen dresses or gowns, often with an extra tunic on top in very cold weather. Both men and women wore some kind of head covering, caps for men and veils, or wimples for women. Clothes weren't fitted the way modern clothes are. They were made of simple shapes, rectangles and squares sewn together, with little tailoring. This made them easier to make and meant they could be handed down or remade as children grew or adults changed size. Sewing was done with bone or metal needles and thread made from linen or wool. Seams were simple and strong, meant to last through years of wear and washing. Decorations were minimal for everyday clothes, though special occasion clothes might have embroidery around the neck or sleeves. Colours were natural and earthy. Undyed wool came in shades of white, brown, grey and black, depending on the sheep. Plant dyes could add colours like yellow from weld or onion skins, red from madder roots, blue from woad leaves, or green from combining blue and yellow dyes. But dyes were expensive and took time to prepare, so most everyday clothes were the natural colour of the wool. For the very poorest people, winter clothes might be patched and repatched until little of the original fabric remained. Nothing was wasted. When clothes were finally too worn to wear, they would be cut up for baby clothes, patches for other garments, or even stuffing for mattresses. What about shoes? Most medieval peasants wore simple leather shoes in winter, sometimes with wooden clogs over them in wet weather. The leather was often rubbed with fat to make it more water resistant. In the coldest areas, people might stuff their shoes with straw for extra warmth or wrap wool cloths around their feet inside their shoes. The work of making winter clothes never really stopped. Even in midwinter, when other outdoor work was impossible, women would be spinning and weaving for the next year's clothes. Men might be repairing leather shoes or making new ones. Children would help by carding wool or winding yarn onto bobbins. But how warm were these clothes really? Would they keep out the bitter winds and snow of a northern European winter? Medieval wool clothes were surprisingly good at keeping people warm, even in the harshest winters. Wool has natural properties that make it perfect for cold weather. It can hold a lot of warmth close to the body, and it stays warm even when it gets a little wet from snow or rain. The way medieval people made their wool cloth helped too. By fulling the cloth, that pounding process we talked about, they created fabric that was thick and dense, with tiny air pockets that trapped body heat. Modern tests on recreated medieval cloth have shown it can be as warm as today's wool blankets. But wool clothes alone weren't always enough in the deepest cold. People used other clever tricks to stay warm. Many lined their cloaks with fur if they could get it. Even humble peasants might have rabbit fur, which was common and easy to get from trapping. Wealthier people might use fox, beaver, or even imported furs like sable. Layers were the key to warmth. On really cold days, a person might wear their everyday clothes with their Sunday best on top, not to look fancy, but just to have an extra layer. They also used scarves, mittens, and leg wrappings made from wool strips, wound around their lower legs like bandages. For the very coldest nights or days, people might wrap themselves in wool blankets on top of their regular clothes. These blankets were similar to the cloth used for cloaks, but often thicker. A family might own just one or two good blankets, which would be shared as needed. But medieval wool clothes had some downsides too. They were heavy. A full set of winter clothes could weigh several pounds. They could also be itchy against the skin, which is why people wore linen undergarments when possible. Linen is made from the flax plant and is much smoother and softer than wool. Another problem was that wool clothes were hard to clean. Unlike today's clothes that we can just throw in the washing machine, medieval wool wasn't washed very often because it could shrink or felt if washed wrong. Instead, clothes were aired out, brushed and spot cleaned when needed. The smell of unwashed wool clothes worn day after day through a winter when bathing was rare would be pretty strong by modern standards. People were used to it though, and everyone smelled the same way, so no one really noticed or minded. Special clothing challenges came up during certain winter activities. For instance, when men went hunting in the snow, they needed to be able to move freely while staying warm. They might wear slightly shorter tunics and make sure their leg wrappings were secure. They might also carry an extra cloak to put on when they had to stand still waiting for animals. Women who needed to work outside in winter, perhaps feeding animals or gathering firewood, had to deal with long skirts that could get wet in the snow. They would often tuck their skirts up into their belts to keep the hems dry, or wear a shorter work dress over their regular one when doing outdoor chores. Children's winter clothes were basically smaller versions of adult clothes, though. Parents tried to make sure children had the warmest pieces of clothing available. Growing children presented a special problem. They might outgrow clothes before they wore them out. Clothes were often made with extra material that could be let out as a child grew, and hand-me-downs from older siblings were common. Babies and toddlers needed extra warmth since they couldn't tell adults if they were cold. They were usually bundled in several layers of linen and wool, with special attention to keeping their heads covered. A cold head loses a lot of body heat. When mothers had to work outside, they might carry very young babies wrapped against their bodies under their cloaks, sharing body heat. Winter clothes weren't just practical, they were also valuable possessions. A good wool cloak might be mentioned in a person's will, to be passed down to a specific family member. Clothes were sometimes stolen, and the theft of winter clothing was particularly serious because it could leave someone vulnerable to cold and illness. Taking care of winter clothes was an important job. After each winter, clothes would be carefully cleaned, repaired, and stored away from moths and mice. Herbs like lavender or tansy might be packed with stored woolens to keep insects away. When next winter came, the clothes would be brought out, checked again for any needed repairs, and put back into use. Not everyone had enough warm clothes, of course. The poorest people might have only one set of clothes for all seasons, perhaps, with an extra cloak or shawl for winter. In very cold regions, this could be deadly. Church records from medieval times mention people occasionally freezing to death during harsh winters, often the elderly or very poor who lacked adequate clothing. Communities tried to help those in need. Churches sometimes collected and distributed clothing to the poor. Lords of manors might give cloth or old clothes to their workers as part of their payment. Extended families shared resources, with those who had more helping those with less. One interesting aspect of medieval winter clothing is how it affected movement and activity. The heavy layers made people move more slowly and deliberately in winter. Work that required fine finger movements became harder when hands were cold or covered with mittens. Even walking through snow in heavy clothes took more energy. This slower pace of life during winter months wasn't seen as a bad thing, though. It matched the natural rhythm of the seasons and gave people's bodies a chance to rest from the intense physical labor of farming during the growing season. Village. Craft specialists played important roles in winter clothing production. While most families did their own spinning and weaving, skilled weavers might create better quality cloth for special purposes. Some villages had fullers who specialized in processing cloth after weaving. Tailors, though rare in small villages, might travel through the countryside, staying a few days in each place to help with more complicated sewing projects. Over time, clothing styles changed, but very slowly compared to modern fashion. A tunic or cloak style might remain basically the same for 100 years or more, with only small changes in length or fit. This meant that clothes could be passed down through several generations, and old people might wear styles similar to what they had worn as young people. The skills needed to make winter clothes, spinning, weaving, sewing, were learned from childhood and practiced throughout life. They weren't just practical skills, but also connected to a person's identity and place in society. A woman known for her fine spinning might be respected for this skill just as much as a man known for his skill at ploughing or blacksmithing. As winter dragged on, people would already be planning and working on the next year's clothes. The work of processing wool, making yarn, and weaving cloth was a continuous cycle that connected one year to the next and one generation to the next. But clothing alone couldn't keep people warm in the freezing temperatures of northern European winters. How did they heat their homes? What did medieval houses look like, and how did they keep the bitter cold outside? The making of winter clothes brought people together in ways that strengthened community bonds. On long winter evenings, families might gather in one cottage to work on textile projects together. This wasn't just practical, saving fuel by heating one house instead of many. It was also social. Imagine a winter night in Warren Percy. Snow falls softly outside. Inside a small cottage, 2 or 3 families have gathered. The only light comes from the central hearth fire and perhaps a few precious candles or rushlights made from rushes dipped in fat. In this warm, flickering light, people work with their hands while they talk, sing, and tell stories. Women spin wool into yarn, their fingers working almost automatically after years of practice. Men might be doing leather work for new shoes or repairing wooden tools. Older children card wool or help with simple sewing tasks. while the youngest play quietly or fall asleep in the warmth. These gatherings, sometimes called bees or sittings, were important social events during the isolated winter months. News would be shared, marriages might be planned, and disputes resolved. Folk tales and family stories passed from one generation to the next during these cozy evenings. The shared work of clothing production helped bind medieval communities together. When a family suffered bad luck, perhaps illness during shearing, time or the death of someone who did the weaving, others in the village would step in to help. No one could survive alone, and textile work was one of the ways people created bonds of mutual support. Special events in the textile making calendar became community celebrations. Sheep shearing in spring might end with a small feast for those who helped. The first lighting of the spinning wheels after harvest might be marked with special foods or drinks. These celebrations helped break up the monotony of work and gave people something to look forward to. Over the years, people developed ways to make the work more enjoyable. Spinning and weaving songs helped keep a steady rhythm and pass the time. Games were created around textile work, like contests to see who could spin the most even thread or card wool the fastest. Children learned by watching and joining in. When they were ready, older people played important roles in teaching textile skills. A grandmother, whose hands were too stiff for fine spinning, might still be able to teach a young girl the right tension for good yarn. An elderly man might carve the best spindles, or make intricate buttons from bone or wood. These contributions kept older people connected to community life. Different regions developed their own distinctive styles for winter clothes. In very cold northern areas, clothes might be fuller and thicker. In slightly milder regions, they might use lighter weight. Wool for more flexibility. Local decoration styles, specific embroidery stitches or color combinations became part of regional identity. We know about these regional differences from rare surviving pieces of medieval clothing, from illustrations in manuscripts, and from archaeological finds. For example, bodies preserved in peat bogs have sometimes been found with their clothes intact, giving us a window into what ordinary people really wore. The colours of medieval winter clothes tell us something about people's love of beauty even in practical items. While everyday clothes were often the natural colours of wool, special touches of colour might be added to brighten the dark winter months. A band of red embroidery at a sleeve edge or a blue tablet woven border on a cloak brought a touch of brightness to the grey winter landscape. Certain clothing items took on special meaning. A wedding shawl might be carefully stored and brought out each winter, carrying memories of an important day. A cloak made from the wool of a special sheep might be valued above others. A cap knitted by a beloved grandmother might be someone's most treasured possession. By late winter, when stores of food were running low and the dark days seemed endless, having warm clothes could make the difference between life and death. In the coldest regions, people might stay in bed longer on winter mornings, sharing body heat under layers of wool blankets to conserve energy and warmth. When spring finally arrived, winter clothes would be carefully cleaned and stored away. Woolen items needed protection from moths, whose larvae eat wool. People used strong-smelling herbs like rosemary, lavender, and tansy to repel moths. They might also store woolens in sealed chests, checking them occasionally through the summer. The annual cycle would begin again with sheep shearing, followed by all the steps of turning raw wool into warm winter garments. Year after year, generation after generation, this cycle continued, with small improvements in technique passed down through families. Today, we might think of clothes as disposable items that we replace when styles change. But for medieval people, clothes were valuable possessions that represented many hours of work. A good winter cloak might be used for a decade or more, carefully mended when needed, and eventually cut down to make children's clothes when it was too worn for adult use. The skills involved in making winter clothes from wool, from raising sheep to spinning, weaving, and sewing were essential knowledge that everyone in the community shared to some degree. These weren't specialized skills known only to a few experts, but common knowledge that helped everyone survive. In our modern world of central heating and store-bought clothes, it's hard to imagine how important warm wool clothing was to our ancestors. Their lives literally depended on the knowledge of how to transform sheep's wool into warm garments that could protect them from freezing temperatures. The next time you put on a warm sweater or coat on a cold day, you might think about all the work that would have gone into making such an item in medieval times. From the shepherd watching over the sheep to the spinner, weaver, and person who sewed the final garment, many hands and many hours of skilled work would have created a single warm winter outfit. And while we've talked about the practical aspects of medieval winter clothes, perhaps the most important part was how this shared work brought people together, creating bonds that helped communities survive through countless cold winters, generation after generation. But staying warm wasn't just about what people wore. Equally important was how they heated their homes during the coldest months. What did a medieval cottage look like inside? And how did families keep warm when temperatures dropped below freezing? When we think of a cozy home in winter, we might imagine a big house with a furnace keeping every room warm. But for a family in medieval England, home was very different. Their house, usually called a cottage, was small, simple, and heating. It was a challenge that took planning, work, and some clever ideas. Let's visit a typical peasant cottage in Warren Percy during winter. From the outside, it doesn't look very impressive. It's a single-room house, maybe 15 to 20 feet long and 10 to 15 feet wide, about the size of a modern living room. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a framework of wooden sticks woven together, the wattle, and covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung or hair, the daub. The roof is thatched, covered with thick layers of straw, reeds, or rushes. It slopes steeply, so rain and snow will slide off instead of soaking through. There are no glass windows. Glass was far too expensive for ordinary people. Instead, there might be one or two small openings covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth that let in a little light when open. The door is solid wood, made to keep out wind and weather. It might have a simple wooden latch with a leather string that can be pulled through a small hole to open it from outside. At night, the string is pulled inside so no one can enter. Stepping inside, the first thing you'd notice is that it's dim. Even during the day, not much light comes in through the small windows. Your eyes would need time to adjust after being outside. The floor is packed earth, perhaps with rushes or straw scattered over it for a bit of softness and warmth. In wealthier homes, these might be mixed with sweet-smelling herbs to help cover everyday smells. The cottage has no separate rooms, just one space where the family cooks, eats, works, and sleeps. Different areas of the room have different uses, but there are no walls dividing them. In the center of the room is the hearth, an open fire pit in the middle of the floor. There might be a circle of stones around it to keep the fire contained, but in many cottages, it's just a designated spot on the earth floor. This hearth is the heart of the home, providing light, heat, and a place to cook. Above the hearth, in the roof, is an opening to let smoke out. It's not a proper chimney. Those became common later in the medieval period. Just a hole in the thatch. Some smoke escapes this way, but much of it fills the upper part of the cottage before slowly finding its way out. This is why the inside of the roof is black with years of soot. Around the edges of the room are the family's few possessions. One area might have sleeping pallets, simple mattresses stuffed with straw or dried grass and raised slightly off the ground on platforms. These would be covered with wool blankets or furs for warmth. Another area might have a wooden chest containing the family's clothes and perhaps a few treasured items. There would be cooking pots, probably made of clay rather than metal, which was expensive, and simple wooden bowls and spoons. A weaving loom might stand against one wall if the family made their own cloth. This small, simple home doesn't seem very promising for staying warm in freezing weather. How did families keep from freezing during the cold months? The hearth fire was their main source of heat, kept burning day and night during the coldest times. Each family member had jobs related to keeping the fire going. Children might gather, kindling, small sticks and bits of dry material that catch fire easily. Women often tended the fire during the day while cooking and doing indoor work. Men might be responsible for cutting and splitting larger pieces of wood. Keeping a fire burning all winter took a huge amount of fuel. A family might need 10 to 15 cords of wood to get through a cold winter. That's a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 120 to 180 feet long. Gathering this much wood was a year-round project. However, most peasants couldn't just cut any wood they wanted. Forests often belonged to the lord of the manor or to the king, and there were strict rules about what could be gathered. Usually, peasants had the right to collect dead wood, branches that had already fallen, but not to cut down trees. Some forests had special days when villagers could collect more wood, perhaps after the lord's workers had cut trees and left the smaller branches behind. Because wood could be scarce or hard to gather, medieval people became experts at using every bit of fuel efficiently. They didn't waste large pieces of wood during warmer parts of the day. Instead, they might keep the fire going with smaller sticks, dried dung, yes, animal poop, dried until it burned without much smell, or peat, a kind of soil that burns slowly. If they lived in an area where it was found, the design of the cottage itself helped keep in what heat there was. The thick walls of wattle and daub provided some insulation. The layer of thatch on the roof, often a foot thick or more, trapped a layer of air that helped insulate the house. Even the smoke lingering near the ceiling, though unpleasant to breathe, formed a layer of warmer air that helped keep heat from escaping through the roof. Still, medieval cottages were drafty by modern standards. Wind could find its way through small cracks in the walls or around the door and window coverings. To fight these drafts, families would stuff rags, straw, or moss into the biggest gaps. They might hang wool cloths over windows or across corners to block wind and create smaller spaces that were easier to heat. The smoke from the open hearth was both a problem and a benefit. It irritated eyes and lungs and blackened the inside of the cottage with soot. But it also helped preserve the roof thatch by making it less attractive to insects and rodents, and it kept the upper parts of the cottage drier by absorbing moisture. Around the hearth, family members would arrange themselves based on warmth needs and status. The elderly, who often felt the cold more severely, might be given spots closest to the fire. Young children would also stay near the warmth. Working adults, generating their own body heat through activity, might work farther from the fire, but still within its warming circle. Even with the fire, the cottage would never reach the temperatures we're used to in modern homes. People didn't expect to be fully warm in winter, just warm enough to prevent frostbite and severe discomfort. They accepted that winter meant being a bit chilly most of the time. At night, when the fire burned lower, staying warm became more challenging. Families often slept together on shared pallets, using each other's body heat to supplement blankets and coverings. Parents might sleep with young children between them for warmth. Extended family living in the same cottage meant more shared body heat at night. Animals sometimes came inside during the coldest weather, especially at night. A family's dog would sleep near people, adding its body heat to the mix. In some regions, smaller livestock like chickens, or even a valued calf or lamb might be brought in during freezing weather. Their body heat helped warm the cottage, though, of course, it added to the crowding and smells. But what about when people needed to leave the relative warmth of the cottage? How did they deal with the cold when going outside was necessary? And how did the heating needs change as winter progressed? Going outside in winter wasn't something medieval people did without good reason. When they had to leave their cottages, they bundled up in layers of wool clothing, as we learned in our last story. They tried to do outdoor chores in the middle of the day when temperatures were highest. Still, many winter tasks couldn't be avoided. Animals needed to be fed and watered daily. Water had to be carried from the village well or stream. Firewood needed to be brought in. Trips to the mill to grind grain might be necessary. Each family developed routines to make these outdoor tasks more bearable. They might heat rocks in the fire, then wrap them in cloth to carry for warmth while doing outdoor chores. They would work quickly and efficiently, having planned exactly what needed to be done before going into the cold. Coming back into the cottage after being out in freezing weather was a moment of relief. People would gather near the fire, warming hands and feet gradually to avoid the painful tingling that comes when very cold skin warms too quickly. As winter progressed, heating challenges changed. In early winter, cottages still held some of the warmth they had absorbed during summer and fall. The thatch and walls that had been warmed by months of sun gave back some of that stored heat. But by midwinter, this stored warmth was gone, and the cold seemed to seep into every corner. January and February were often the hardest months. Fuel supplies might be running low. The coldest days and nights put the most stress on people and their heating systems. This was when clever heating strategies became most important. One strategy was to heat just part of the cottage. By hanging wool cloths or skins across one corner of the room, a family could create a smaller space that was easier to keep warm. They might all crowd into this area on the coldest days, coming out only when necessary. Another strategy involved timing. The cottage would be warmest just after cooking the main meal of the day, usually in the afternoon. Families would use this time for activities needing more warmth or better light, perhaps sewing or detailed craft work. Less critical tasks would be saved for cooler times. Beds were made as warm as possible for nighttime. Before sleeping, someone might run a warming pan, a metal container filled with hot coals, between the blankets to take the chill off. People slept in their clothes, often including caps to keep their heads warm. Extra layers of blankets, cloaks, or even bags stuffed with straw added more insulation against the cold night. Special heating concerns arose for certain groups. Babies and very young children, with their smaller bodies, lost heat quickly and needed extra protection. They were kept near the fire, wrapped in extra layers, and often slept with parents who could monitor their warmth throughout the night. The elderly also face special challenges. Older people generally feel cold more easily, and those with stiff joints found the pain worsened by cold. Families made sure older members had warmer spots in the cottage and extra coverings at night. Some elderly people rarely left the cottage during the coldest months. What about the very poor who might not have enough fuel? This was a serious concern. Villagers generally helped each other in such cases. Sharing fuel with those in desperate need was seen as a basic community duty. The Christian teaching to help those in need was taken seriously, especially in life or death situations like freezing weather. Churches sometimes provided warming spaces for those most in need. Church buildings, often made of stone, weren't necessarily warmer than cottages, but on Sundays when they were heated for services, they offered a chance for everyone to get warm at least once a week. Some monasteries had policies of providing fuel to the poorest during extreme cold. Special heating adaptations were made for certain activities. Families who did winter handcrafts might build small clay containers that held coals from the main fire, providing extra warmth for hands working on detailed tasks. Women spinning thread might keep a small pot of warm water nearby to dip their fingers in occasionally, to keep them flexible enough to feel the wool properly. The medieval understanding of health included ideas about cold and warmth that affected heating practices. They believed certain illnesses came from cold entering the body, which wasn't entirely wrong. We now know that cold temperatures can lower immune response. They were especially careful to protect the chest, head, and feet from cold, seeing these as vulnerable areas. People also understood that the very young and very old were most at risk from extreme cold. Infants were tightly wrapped and kept close to the fire or their mother's body heat. Elderly people might hardly leave their beds during the coldest spells, with food and drink brought to them to minimize their exposure to cold. Medieval winter heating had practical impacts on daily life. The smoky environment inside cottages affected people's health, likely contributing to eye irritations and respiratory problems. The limited light during winter months, both from shorter days and from being indoors away from the cold, restricted what activities were possible. Yet people adapted remarkably well. They developed routines based on the warmest times of day. They created indoor activities that could be done in dim light and limited space. They learned to live with a level of cold that most modern people would find difficult to tolerate. The hardest times came when heating plans failed. A roof might leak during a winter storm, letting in cold and dampness. stored firewood might run out earlier than expected if the winter was unusually long. A family member might fall ill, making it harder to maintain the fire or complete necessary outdoor tasks. In these situations, the community support system became essential. Neighbors helped repair a damaged roof before the cold could take hold. Inside, families with extra firewood shared with those who had run short. People took turns caring for sick neighbors to ensure their fires kept burning. By March, the worst of the winter cold usually began to ease. The days grew noticeably longer, allowing more time for outdoor work and reducing the hours the cottage needed to be heated. The sun began to warm the cottage walls during the day, even if nights remained cold. This transitional time brought its own challenges. Melting snow could make the ground muddy and even harder to travel across than frozen ground had been, but the promise of spring was in the air, with its warmth and new growth, and people began preparing for the season ahead, while still maintaining their winter heating routines. Looking back at medieval cottage heating reminds us how resilient people can be. Without thermostats, furnaces, or insulated walls, families found ways to survive even the coldest winters. They did it through careful planning, efficient use of resources, and working together as families and communities. But even with the best heating strategies, winter cold often led to winter illnesses. How did medieval people deal with coughs, fevers, and other sicknesses during the coldest months when modern medicine didn't exist? The heating methods of medieval cottages were far from perfect. By our modern standards, the cottages were drafty, unevenly heated, and often filled with smoke. But these imperfect methods had developed over centuries and represented the best solutions available with the materials and knowledge people had. One interesting aspect of medieval heating that we haven't discussed yet is the social dimension. The hearth fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was the center of family life. Gathered around the fire on winter evenings, family members would talk, tell stories, sing songs, and pass down knowledge from one generation to the next. Children might hear about their family history or learn important moral lessons through stories told by firelight. Young people might learn practical skills as they watched adults work by the fire. The warm glow of the hearth created a special atmosphere that strengthened family bonds during the long winter evenings. The fire also played an important role in community relationships. A neighbor coming to visit would be invited to the warmest spot near the fire as a sign of welcome. Sharing fire was deeply meaningful. If a family's fire went out, a serious problem before matches were invented, they could go to a neighbor to get burning coals to restart their own hearth. This literal sharing of warmth created bonds of mutual support. Fire had symbolic and religious meanings too. In pre-Christian times, the hearth fire represented the center of the home and was sometimes associated with household gods or protective spirits. Even after Christianity became dominant, many people maintained special traditions around the hearth. Some would make the sign of the cross over the fire at night when banking it, covering it with ashes to keep it burning slowly until morning. Others had special prayers or blessings for the fire. During major Christian holidays, particularly Christmas, the fire took on extra significance. Many regions had the tradition of the Yule log, an especially large piece of wood selected to burn over the Christmas period. The lighting of this log was often accompanied by special foods, drinks, or blessings. Some families kept a piece of the Yule log to start the next year's Christmas fire, creating a connection between years. Different regions developed heating variations based on local conditions. In areas with less access to wood, people relied more heavily on alternative fuels. Peat, partially decomposed plant material found in boggy areas, was common in parts of northern Europe. Dried dung was used where animals were plentiful, but wood was scarce. In coastal areas, dried seaweed might supplement other fuels. The type of cottage also varied by region, affecting how it was heated. In some areas, cottages were partly dug into the ground, called earth-fast or Grubenhaus designs, which provided more insulation. In others, they were built above ground, but banked with earth around the base for added warmth. Stone cottages, more common in areas where suitable stone was plentiful, held heat differently than wattle and daub structures. As the medieval period progressed, heating technology slowly improved. By the later Middle Ages, around the 14th, 15th centuries, some cottages had proper chimneys rather than just smoke holes. These directed smoke more efficiently out of the living space and allowed for fires to be moved from the center of the room to the wall. Wall hearths with chimneys meant less smoke in the cottage and better use of the heat produced. Some regions developed more sophisticated heating systems earlier than others. In parts of northern Europe, people built raised clay or stone platforms that were heated from below by channeling the smoke from fires through passages under the sleeping area before it exited the building. This system, somewhat similar to the hypocaust heating used in Roman baths, provided a warmer sleeping space with less smoke in the living area. Communal buildings sometimes had better heating than individual cottages. Guild halls, manor houses, and monasteries might have larger fireplaces with proper chimneys, or even multiple heating sources. Some monasteries had separate heated rooms, called calefactories, where monks could warm themselves during the coldest weather. The never-ending need for winter fuel shaped the landscape around medieval villages. Areas near settlements were often cleared of trees over time, forcing villagers to travel farther to collect wood. This led to carefully managed woodlands, called coppices, where trees were cut in a way that allowed them to regrow from the stumps, providing a renewable source of firewood. The timing of winter heating varied with the daylight. Since artificial light was expensive, candles were costly, and even rushlights, made from rushes dipped in fat, required precious resources. People generally woke at dawn and went to bed not long after sunset. In northern regions, with very short winter days, this meant the fire might be kept burning for most of the waking hours. Winter heating needs affected what foods people ate. Cooking soups and stews was efficient because the same fire that heated the cottage also cooked the food, and these dishes could simmer for hours while giving off steam that added humidity to the often dry winter air indoors. Baking bread, which required a hotter fire, might be done less frequently in winter to conserve fuel. The experience of warmth and cold shaped how medieval people thought about comfort. They didn't expect the entire living space to be evenly heated, as we do today. Instead, they thought in terms of warm spots and cold spots, and they moved around the cottage based on their needs at different times. They also accepted seasonal changes in comfort levels as natural. Winter was expected to be a time of some physical discomfort, being a bit cold, staying indoors more, eating simpler foods. This was balanced by the pleasures of gathering around the fire, the social aspects of winter work, and the anticipation of spring's return. By the end of winter, fuel supplies were often running low. Families might need to be especially careful with fire management, banking the coals more thoroughly at night, and perhaps allowing the fire to burn lower during the day. They looked forward to spring not just for warmer weather, but also for the chance to replenish their fuel supplies when new growth appeared and travel became easier. The rhythm of collecting, preparing, and using fuel connected medieval people directly to the natural world around them. They knew which types of wood burned hotter or longer, which produced more smoke, which caught fire easily for starting the morning fire. This practical knowledge was essential for survival and was passed down carefully from parents to children. Looking back at medieval heating methods reminds us of how fundamental warmth is to human comfort and survival, though their methods might seem primitive to us now. Medieval people created remarkably effective systems for staying warm with the resources they had. Their approaches to heating, based on limited resources, careful management, shared effort, and acceptance of seasonal changes, might even offer some lessons for our own thinking about energy use today. As we've seen throughout these stories, surviving winter in medieval times was never about just one thing, not just food storage or clothing or heating. It was the combination of all these practices, along with community support and careful planning, that allowed people to make it through until spring brought new growth and warmth once again. Our next story will look at how people dealt with winter illnesses and injuries without modern medicine. What plants did they use for healing? How did they care for the sick during the coldest months? And how did winter affect health in ways we might not expect today? Winter was a time when staying healthy became more challenging for medieval villagers. The cold weather, limited food, and being crowded together indoors created perfect conditions for illness to spread. Without modern medicine, doctors, or hospitals nearby, most villagers relied on their own knowledge of healing and simple remedies to get through the winter months. In a place like Warren Percy, almost every household knew basic healing practices. This knowledge wasn't held just by specialists, but was part of everyday wisdom, passed down through generations. While there were some people known for having special healing skills, most common winter illnesses were treated at home. The medieval understanding of health was very different from our modern view. They followed ideas that came from ancient Greek and Roman physicians, particularly Galen, who had lived about 1,000 years earlier. This system believed that the body contained 4 different fluids, called humours: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. Good health meant having these 4 humours in the right balance. According to this belief, winter was a time when cold and wet qualities dominated, leading to an increase in phlegm. This explained why people got runny noses and coughs during cold weather. Treatment focused on balancing these qualities with hot and dry remedies. Common winter illnesses included coughs, chest infections, fevers, joint pain, chilblains, painful, swelling on hands and feet caused by poor circulation in cold weather, and various digestive problems. Without knowing about germs or viruses, medieval people still observed that certain illnesses seemed to pass from person to person, especially when everyone was crowded together indoors. When someone got sick in winter, the first treatments usually came from the home's own supply of healing herbs and remedies. Many cottages had bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, plants gathered during summer and preserved specifically for winter medicines. A typical home might have herbs like sage, thyme, rosemary, mint, and chamomile ready for use. One of the most common winter remedies was hot herbal tea. For coughs and chest congestion, they might make tea from thyme or horehound, both of which actually do help soothe coughs. For fevers, meadowsweet or willowbark tea was used, and we now know these contain natural compounds similar to aspirin that can reduce fever and pain. Honey was an important part of winter medicine. It was mixed with herbs for cough syrups, applied directly to chilblains or small wounds, and added to hot drinks for sore throats. Medieval people didn't understand the antibacterial properties of honey that science has now confirmed, but they had observed its healing effects for centuries. Warming treatments were commonly used for winter ailments. Hot compresses made from cloths dipped in hot water and herbs might be applied to aching joints or chests. Small bags filled with heated grain or salt were placed on sore areas, similar to how we might use a hot water bottle today. For chest congestion, people sometimes used a treatment called cupping. This involved heating a cup, usually wooden or clay, and placing it on the chest. As the air inside cooled, it created suction against the skin, which was thought to draw out harmful substances. While the medical theory behind this was incorrect, the heat and increased blood flow to the area might actually have provided some relief. Another common practice was creating poultices, mixtures of herbs, bread, or clay that were applied directly to the skin over an affected area. A mustard poultice, made from ground mustard seeds mixed with flour and water, might be applied to the chest for congestion. The heat and mild irritation it caused was believed to draw out illness. This actually did increase blood flow to the area, which could help the body's natural healing process. For digestive problems, which were common when winter diets became restricted to preserved foods, herbs like mint, fennel, and caraway were brewed into teas or added to food. Many of these herbs actually do help ease gas and stomach discomfort, as modern research has confirmed. Prevention was just as important as treatment. Medieval people had noticed that certain practices seemed to help people stay healthy in winter. They might chew on sprigs of rosemary or carry small bundles of protective herbs to ward off illness. While they believed these worked by countering bad air or evil influences, some herbs like rosemary do have antibacterial properties that might have provided some actual benefit. Winter diet was adjusted to help prevent illness. Foods considered warming were favored, like garlic, onions, and heavily spiced dishes. Garlic was especially valued for preventing illness, and modern science has shown it does have immune-boosting and antimicrobial properties. When possible, people would eat fermented foods like sauerkraut, which provided vitamins that were otherwise scarce in winter. Religious practices and folk customs often blended with medical treatments. Prayers for healing were said alongside herbal remedies. Saints associated with healing might be specially honored during winter months. Some herbs were gathered on particular saints' days or blessed by priests before being used as medicine. The line between food and medicine wasn't clear-cut as it often is today. Many winter dishes were specifically prepared to maintain health. Broths made with herbs, garlic, and whatever meat was available were considered both nourishing and medicinal. Special healing porridges might be made for those who were ill, combining easily digested grains with medicinal herbs. When someone became seriously ill in winter, the challenges multiplied. Travel to find more knowledgeable healers might be impossible on snow-covered or muddy roads. Families relied on the wisdom of village elders and whatever remedies they had on hand. Neighbors would help families with a sick member by sharing healing herbs from their own supplies or taking over chores to allow more time for caregiving. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable during winter illnesses. Young children with coughs or fevers might be kept near the fire, given frequent small amounts of healing teas, and watched carefully day and night. Elderly villagers with winter ailments were often moved to the warmest spot in the cottage and given priority access to the most effective remedies. The physical environment of medieval cottages during winter created special health challenges. Smoke from the central hearth irritated eyes and lungs, potentially worsening respiratory conditions. The combination of smoke, poor ventilation, and crowding made recovery from chest infections particularly difficult. However, certain aromatic herbs like juniper or pine were sometimes thrown into the fire, creating smoke that was believed to purify the air, and some of these plants do release compounds that have mild antimicrobial effects. But what happened when home remedies weren't enough? What more specialized healing knowledge existed, and how did people access it during the difficult winter months? Beyond household remedies, medieval villages had people with more specialized healing knowledge. These weren't doctors, as we think. Of them today, most had no formal education, but had learned through experience and apprenticeship. In a village like Warren Percy, there might be a wise woman or cunning man who knew more about herbs and healing practices than others. They might have special knowledge about which plants worked best for different conditions, or how to prepare more complex medicines. These village healers often stored larger supplies of medicinal herbs and materials than ordinary households. They might have rare herbs from farther away, obtained through traders or pilgrims. They would know how to combine herbs for stronger effects, and how to prepare medicines that could be stored longer. During winter, when travel to larger towns was difficult or impossible, these local healers became especially important. A family with a seriously ill member might send someone through the snow to bring the healer to their cottage, or if the sick person could walk, they might visit the healer's home. Payment for these services rarely involved money, which was scarce in rural communities. Instead, the healer might receive food, firewood, wool, or promises of help with spring planting. Healing was seen as a community service rather than purely a business transaction. Some villages were lucky enough to have a midwife, usually an older woman with experience helping at births. While births happened year-round, winter deliveries presented special challenges. The midwife would advise pregnant women on keeping warm, eating well with limited winter food options, and preparing for a birth during cold weather. When a woman went into labor during winter, neighbors would help ensure the cottage was extra warm. The midwife would bring her own supplies of herbs to ease pain and prevent infections after birth. Special warming treatments were used to help new mothers recover, like heated bricks wrapped in cloth placed near them as they rested. For newborns, special care was taken to keep them warm while still allowing them to breathe safely. They were swaddled tightly in strips of wool cloth, with just their faces exposed and kept near the fire but not too close. Mothers were encouraged to feed babies frequently during winter to help them grow strong. In larger villages or market towns, there might be other types of healers. Barber surgeons combined haircutting with basic surgical procedures like setting broken bones, pulling teeth, or lancing boils. They learned through apprenticeship rather than formal education and used practical skills passed down through generations. During winter, when outdoor work accidents decreased, barber surgeons might see more cases of chilblains, frostbite, or burns from people getting too close to fires. They had treatments for these specific winter injuries, including special ointments made from animal fats mixed with herbs. For serious winter illnesses that didn't respond to village remedies, some communities had access to monastic infirmaries. Monasteries often maintained gardens of medicinal herbs, preserved carefully for winter use, and monks or nuns with special training in healing. In theory, these infirmaries served the poor without charge, following Christian teachings about caring for the sick. However, reaching a monastery during winter could be extremely difficult. Roads might be blocked by snow or turn to mud during thaws. Only the most desperate cases would attempt such journeys, perhaps carrying the sick person on a stretcher or sledge across difficult terrain. University-trained physicians existed in medieval times, but were rare and expensive, serving mostly the nobility and wealthy townspeople. The average village would never see such a physician, especially during winter when travel was limited. Throughout most of the medieval period, medical care remained closely tied to religious beliefs. Illness was sometimes seen as a spiritual issue as much as a physical one. Prayer, confession, and special blessings might be used alongside herbal remedies and physical treatments. Some illnesses had patron saints associated with them, and people would pray to these saints for healing. Saint Blaise was invoked for throat ailments, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, and Saint Sebastian for protection from plague and infectious diseases. Small shrines to these saints might exist in village churches, where the sick could pray and leave simple offerings. Religious houses sometimes offered special objects believed to have healing powers. A monastery might have a relic, perhaps a small bone fragment from a saint, that the sick could touch or pray near. Holy water blessed by priests was used both for drinking and for washing wounds, especially during times when fresh water was scarce. During the darkest part of winter, between Christmas and February, certain religious ceremonies were held specifically to pray for health and protection. Candles blessed on Candlemas, February 2nd, were thought to have special protective powers against winter illness when placed near the sick. For mental health challenges, which could worsen during the dark winter months when people were confined, indoors, religious practices often provided the main treatments. Prayer, confession, attending Mass, and community religious celebrations helped provide structure and meaning during difficult times. Different regions had their own winter healing traditions based on local plants and customs. In coastal areas, seaweed might be used for treating winter joint pain. In forest regions, pine resins were valued for chest complaints. Mountain communities often used different alpine plants that didn't grow in lowlands. While many medieval remedies were based on incorrect theories about how the body worked, generations of practical experience had identified plants and treatments that actually helped. Modern research has confirmed that many traditional herbal remedies do contain active compounds that fight infection, reduce inflammation, or ease symptoms. For example, the willow bark tea used for winter fevers contains salicin, a natural form of the same compound used in aspirin. Garlic, so commonly used in winter cooking and medicine, contains allicin, which has antibacterial properties. Honey, frequently used in cough remedies, has been shown to be as effective as commercial cough suppressants in some studies. Of course, not all medieval treatments were effective. Some were based entirely on superstition or incorrect understanding of the body. Others might have worked partly through the placebo effect, the real phenomenon where believing a treatment will work actually helps the body heal itself better. By late winter, stored medicinal herbs might be running low, just when illness rates were often highest due to months of limited diet and confinement. Families would carefully ration their remaining healing herbs, using smaller amounts or substituting more common plants. The first plants to emerge in early spring were eagerly gathered for their medicinal properties. Dandelion leaves, chickweed, and nettles appeared before other greens and were valued both as food and medicine. These early spring plants, rich in vitamins after months of preserved foods, helped people recover from winter ailments and build strength. While winter presented special health challenges, the knowledge of how to prevent and treat common illnesses was woven into the fabric of daily life. Unlike today, where we might feel helpless without access to doctors or pharmacies, medieval people carried much of their healthcare knowledge with them all the time, ready to use when needed. But what about the social aspects of illness in winter? How did communities care for their sick when resources were already stretched thin by the challenges of cold weather? Caring for the sick during winter involved the entire community. In a medieval village, illness wasn't just a private family matter, it affected everyone, and everyone had a role in helping those who were unwell. When someone fell seriously ill in winter, word would spread quickly through the village. Neighbors would check what the family needed, perhaps extra firewood to keep the cottage warmer, help with tending animals, or specific herbs for remedies. Even in the midst of their own winter challenges, villagers made time to support families dealing with illness. This community care system wasn't organized or official. It was simply how villages function. Today, we might call it a social safety net, but medieval people saw it as a natural extension of Christian values and practical necessity. Everyone knew they might need similar help someday. Women played crucial roles in winter healthcare. While continuing their regular household duties, they would visit sick neighbors, bringing food, remedies, and practical help. Those known for their healing knowledge were especially sought after, but almost all women had some experience with basic care for the ill. Men contributed in different ways. They might chop extra firewood for a household with a sick member, take over the care of animals, or help with heavy tasks that the ill person would normally handle. Young men might be sent to fetch a healer from another village if necessary, braving winter conditions to bring back help. For contagious illnesses, medieval people had observed that sickness could spread from person to person. While they didn't understand germs, they had practical methods to limit spread. Someone with certain kinds of coughs or fevers might be given a separate sleeping area in the cottage. In wealthier households or monasteries, the sick might be completely separated in a different room or building. Children were taught from an early age how to help with health care. They might be sent to gather certain plants that stayed green through winter, like pine needles or holly leaves, which were used in remedies. They would learn to prepare simple treatments by watching adults and helping with easy tasks like grinding dried herbs or stirring mixtures. Older children took on more responsibility, especially if a parent fell ill. They might need to handle cooking, fire tending, and basic care for younger siblings. This practical education meant that by the time they were teenagers, most young, people knew how to manage many aspects of winter healthcare. For the very old or those living alone, winter illness could be dangerous. Village systems ensured these vulnerable people weren't forgotten. Neighbors would check on elderly villagers during cold spells, bringing food and fuel. If an older person became ill, they might be temporarily moved into another family's cottage for better care. This community care extended to decisions about resources. If medicinal supplies ran low during a difficult winter, village leaders might organize sharing of what remained, ensuring that those most in need received treatment. Families with extra stores might contribute to those who had run out. Special foods were prepared for the sick, designed to be easy to eat and digest while providing nourishment. Broths strained to remove solid pieces, bread soaked in milk or ale, and gruels made from finely ground grains were common invalid foods. These were often enriched with whatever nutritious ingredients were available, perhaps an egg from the few chickens still laying in winter, or honey saved for medicinal use. Hospitals, as we know them today, didn't exist in most areas, but some larger towns had institutions called hospitals, or hospices. These were usually run by religious orders and provided basic care for the poor, elderly, or travelers. They weren't medical facilities in the modern sense, but places offering shelter, food, and simple treatments. During winter, these medieval hospitals filled an important need for those without family support. A traveller caught in winter weather might seek shelter there if they fell ill on the road. Orphaned children, elderly people without families, or the very poor might find refuge during the coldest months. The Christian calendar provided structure for winter healthcare. Certain saints' days were associated with healing or protection from specific illnesses. Special prayers and church services during winter focused on themes of light overcoming darkness and health returning to the community. Parish priests played roles in healthcare beyond spiritual comfort. Many had basic medical knowledge, learned from books owned by the church or from experience. They might help assess whether an illness needed spiritual or physical remedies, or both, and could advise on appropriate treatments. Some priests maintained gardens of medicinal herbs on church property, available to parishioners who lacked their own supplies. Church grounds sometimes included plants not commonly grown in home gardens, but useful for specific medical purposes. Winter festivals and celebrations served important health functions beyond their religious significance. The Feast of Christmas, in the darkest part of winter, brought communities together, providing emotional support and shared meals with whatever special foods could be managed. These celebrations helped combat the isolation and low spirits that could affect people during long winter months. The transition from winter to spring was marked by healthcare rituals in many regions. Special foods were prepared using the first spring plants, believed to cleanse the body after winter and prepare it for the year ahead. Spring cleaning wasn't just about tidying cottages, but also about health, airing out spaces that had been smoky and closed up all winter. Looking back at medieval winter healthcare shows us a system that, while lacking scientific understanding of disease, compensated through community support, practical knowledge passed down through generations, and careful use of available resources. Without access to modern medicine, people focused on prevention, early intervention, and supportive care that helped many survive until warmer weather returned. The knowledge of which plants helped, which conditions, how to prepare effective remedies, and how to care for different winter ailments represented centuries of careful observation and experience. This wisdom wasn't written in books for most village healers, but carried in memory and demonstrated through practice. Perhaps most importantly, medieval winter healthcare reminds us that healing happens in community. The combined efforts of family members, neighbors, local healers, and religious figures created a network of support that helped people through their most vulnerable times during the harshest season. As spring's first green shoots pushed through the melting snow, medieval villagers would begin to replenish their stocks of medicinal plants, carefully gathering and preserving new herbs for the next winter's needs. The cycle of preparation, use, and renewal continued year after year, a testament to their resilience and practical wisdom in the face of winter's challenges. But individual families couldn't face all of winter's challenges alone, no matter how skilled they were at food preservation, clothing production, heating, or healthcare. How did entire villages work together to make sure everyone survived until spring? What systems of mutual aid and cooperation made the difference between life and death during the coldest months? In the medieval village of Warren-Percy, as in thousands of other villages across Europe, winter survival wasn't just about what individual families did. It was about how the entire community worked together. The harsh realities of winter pushed people to cooperate in ways that created strong bonds and practical support systems. Unlike today, when we might go days without really needing our neighbors, medieval villagers depended on each other constantly, and this dependency grew even stronger during winter. The community wasn't just a nice addition to life, it was essential for survival. Let's start by looking at how villages prepared together for winter's arrival. As the harvest season ended in early fall, communities organized collective activities to ensure everyone was ready for the cold months ahead. One of the most important community events was the autumn slaughter, Most villagers couldn't feed all their animals through winter, so they would kill many of them in late fall. This wasn't something each family did alone. Instead, the whole village might gather for several days of intense work. Men would handle the actual butchering, while women and children would process the meat, cutting, salting, smoking, and preparing different parts for storage. Young people would run messages between work areas or bring water for cleaning. Older people with experience would oversee the work, making sure everything was done properly so the meat would last through winter. This communal slaughter allowed for efficient use of every part of the animals. Blood was collected for blood, puddings. Intestines were cleaned for sausage casings. Fat was rendered for cooking and lighting. Bones were saved for making tools or boiled for soup. Even parts not good for human consumption were used as dog food or added to compost piles for next year's fields. At the end of the slaughter days, there was often a community feast using parts of the meat that couldn't be preserved. This celebration marked the transition to winter preparations and allowed everyone to enjoy fresh meat before settling into months of preserved foods. Another important communal activity was wood gathering. While families collected firewood throughout the year, villages often organized special wood gathering expeditions in the weeks before winter set in. On these days, nearly everyone in the village who could work would participate. Men would cut larger pieces and split logs. Women would gather smaller branches. Children would collect kindling. Older villagers might stay behind to watch the youngest children and prepare food for the workers' return. The wood collected during these community efforts wasn't always divided equally. Some might go to the village church to heat it for services. Some might be set aside specifically for widows, the elderly, or families facing hardship. The division wasn't about strict equality, but about ensuring everyone had enough to survive. Food sharing systems were formalized in many villages to help. During winter, some communities created hunger insurance by setting aside a portion of the harvest in a communal store, often kept in the church or a special building. This food could be distributed during late winter if some families ran short. The manor system, while often oppressive in many ways, sometimes included provisions for winter support. The lord of the manor might be expected to provide assistance to villagers during extremely harsh winters. This wasn't pure charity, but part of the unwritten social contract. Healthy tenants who survived winter could work the lord's fields in spring. Religious institutions played crucial roles in winter community support. Monasteries near villages often provided food to the poor, especially during the hunger gap of late winter when stored food ran low, but new crops weren't yet available. Church teachings emphasized the Christian duty to help those in need, particularly during winter hardships. Parish churches became community centers during winter, not just for religious services, but for social support. Sunday services were times when the entire village gathered, sharing news and checking on neighbors who might need help. After services, people might linger to discuss community needs and organize assistance for families facing difficulties. Winter weather created specific challenges that required community response. After heavy snowfalls, villagers would work together to clear paths between cottages and to essential places like the well, mill, or church. When streams or wells froze, stronger members of the community would break the ice and help ensure everyone had access to water. Community mills were especially important during winter. Most villages had their grain ground at watermills or windmills that served the entire community. Keeping access to these mills open during winter was a priority. Villagers would clear snow from roads leading to the mill and help repair damage from winter storms or freezing. What about families who faced special hardships? Perhaps a father had been injured and couldn't collect firewood, or a mother was too ill to care for young children. In these cases, the community stepped in with collective support. For a family with an injured member, neighbors might organize a work party to complete essential winter preparations. Some villages had rotating schedules for checking on vulnerable households during the coldest periods. Children from families in crisis might be temporarily housed with relatives or neighbors to ensure they stayed warm and fed. winter also presented dangers from outside the community. In some regions, wolves grew bolder during winter months when food was scarce, sometimes threatening livestock or even people. Villages organized watch rotations during dangerous periods, with men taking turns, staying alert for predators or other threats. Some medieval communities developed specific winter roles or responsibilities. A village might have designated fire wardens, whose job was to check cottages for fire safety during the dangerous winter months when hearths burned constantly. Others might assign certain families to maintain essential paths after snowfalls, or to check on elderly villagers living alone. The rhythm of winter village life included planned gatherings that served both practical and social purposes. Work that could be done indoors, like repairing tools, spinning wool, or making candles, was often done in groups to save on heating fuel and lighting, while providing company during the dark days. These work gatherings rotated between cottages, spreading the burden of extra heating and bringing moments of community into each family's home throughout winter. While working, people would share stories, songs, or news, turning necessary tasks into social occasions that helped fight the isolation of winter. Special attention was paid to supporting new mothers during winter. Childbirth happened year-round, and having a new baby during cold months created additional challenges. Village women would organize help for new mothers, bringing food, extra fuel, and taking turns assisting with other children or household tasks while the mother recovered and cared for the infant. But how did villagers handle conflicts during winter, when everyone was under stress from cold, limited food, and confinement? And what happened when winter lasted longer than expected, stretching resources beyond what families had prepared? Winter's hardships sometimes created tensions within villages. Confined indoors, dealing with limited resources, and facing the constant worry of whether supplies would last until spring, people could become irritable and conflicts might arise. Yet medieval communities had developed ways to manage these tensions before they threatened the group's survival. Village leaders played important roles in preventing and resolving winter conflicts. These might be formal leaders like the village reeve, an official who oversaw daily operations and represented the village to the manor lord, or informal ones, elders respected for their wisdom or experience. When arguments or disagreements occurred, these leaders would help work out solutions that kept the peace. Many villages had regular meetings, especially during winter when outdoor work was limited. These gatherings allowed for airing concerns, discussing fair distribution of resources, and planning cooperative work. By addressing small problems before they grew, these meetings helped maintain community harmony during difficult times. Religious leaders also helped mediate conflicts. The parish priest wasn't just a spiritual guide, but often a peacemaker when tensions rose. The Christian emphasis on forgiveness and charity was regularly reinforced during winter sermons, reminding everyone of their duty to support rather than fight with neighbors. Community celebrations provided vital emotional release during the stress of winter. Even with limited resources, villages marked important feast days with special activities. Christmas, New Year's, Candlemas, February 2nd, and other winter holy days became opportunities for shared meals, music, games, and storytelling that reinforced community bonds. These celebrations weren't just about fun, they served practical psychological purposes. They gave people something to look forward to during dark days, provided opportunities to safely release tensions through games or dancing, and reminded everyone of their shared identity and values beyond immediate hardships. Gift-giving customs during winter festivals often focused on practical items that helped with survival. A small gift of preserved fruit, candles, or wool might be exchanged between families. Not extravagant presents, but thoughtful items that showed care while also meeting real needs. Community storytelling took on special importance during winter evenings. Gathered in whatever space could be kept warmest, villagers would share tales that had been passed down for generations. These weren't just entertainment, but vehicles for transmitting practical wisdom, moral lessons, and community history to younger generations. Many winter stories specifically emphasized values of cooperation and mutual support. Tales of foolish individuals who refused help and suffered consequences were contrasted with stories of communities that worked together and thrived despite challenges. These narratives reinforced the social values that kept villages functioning through difficult times. For children, winter brought a different rhythm of learning. With less outdoor work to do, older community members had more time to teach young people important skills. Boys might learn tool repair or woodworking beside grandfathers or uncles. Girls might receive more intensive instruction in spinning, weaving, or food preparation from mothers and aunts. This intergenerational knowledge transfer ensured survival skills weren't lost and gave older villagers meaningful roles during winter months. It also provided structure for children's days when they couldn't burn energy outdoors as much as during warmer seasons. Games and competitions offered both entertainment and skill development during winter confinement. Simple board games made from wood or stone pieces taught strategic thinking. Physical games played inside larger cottages or barns helped maintain strength and coordination. Contests in storytelling, riddle solving, or singing developed mental agility and cultural knowledge. When winter lasted longer than expected, communities faced difficult decisions about resource allocation. If food stores ran low before spring growth began, villages needed fair systems to ensure the most vulnerable didn't starve while others had enough. These extended winters tested the strength of community bonds. Historical records show that some villages developed remarkable sharing systems. Families with surplus would contribute to those running short, with the understanding that roles might be reversed in future years. This wasn't viewed as charity but as mutual insurance against winter's unpredictability. Religious institutions often stepped in during extended winter hardships. Monasteries might open their storehouses to nearby villages if true famine threatened. Parish churches used tithes, the tenth of produce contributed by villagers throughout the year, to support those in greatest need when winter stretched beyond normal limits. Village leaders sometimes had to make difficult decisions about rationing during extended winters. They might determine that certain foods should be reserved for children, pregnant women, or those doing essential winter work. These decisions weren't made by single individuals, but through community consultation, ensuring they were seen as fair even when painful. Communication between villages became crucial during extended winter hardships. If one community was running dangerously low on certain supplies, messengers might be sent to nearby villages to arrange trades or request assistance. Regional networks of mutual aid could develop, especially in areas prone to harsh winters. For travelers caught by winter weather or extended cold, villages had customs of hospitality despite their own limited resources. A stranger might be allowed to sleep in the church, the mill, or even in villagers' homes on a rotating basis. This hospitality wasn't just charitable, it recognized that anyone might someday need similar help when traveling. Winter also created opportunities for strengthening bonds between neighboring communities. Villages might coordinate wolf hunts if predators threatened the area. They might share the services of specialized craftspeople who traveled between communities during winter, like blacksmiths repairing metal tools or tailors helping with winter clothing needs. Market towns became important gathering points even in winter, though less frequently than during warmer months. On market days when weather permitted travel, villagers from surrounding areas would meet to trade goods, share news, and maintain connections that might prove vital if one community faced particular hardship. The elderly held special status during winter months. Their experience of previous hard winters provided valuable guidance when communities faced difficult decisions. They could recall what had worked in the past when food ran short or cold lasted longer than expected. This historical knowledge was respected and sought out when challenges arose. Winter's enforced togetherness also strengthened family bonds. Multiple generations often shared small living spaces, working, eating, and sleeping in close proximity for months. While this could sometimes create tension, it also fostered deep connections and ensured knowledge and values passed between generations. By late winter, as food stores dwindled and patience grew thin, communities faced their greatest tests of solidarity. How did they maintain hope and cooperation during these final difficult weeks before spring's arrival? The final weeks of winter, often called the hungry gap or the starving time, tested community bonds most severely. Food stores had dwindled, firewood supplies might be running low, and patience wore thin after months of cold and confinement. Yet villages developed specific strategies to get through this challenging period together. Late winter community rituals became especially important for maintaining morale. Many villages held festivals marking the midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox around February Vestitu, known as Candlemas in Christian traditions, or Imbolc in older customs. These celebrations emphasized the gradual return of light and warmth, offering hope when winter seemed endless. Communities watched eagerly for the first signs of spring, the appearance of certain birds, the earliest spring flowers or buds forming on trees were noted and shared as encouraging news throughout the village. Children might be sent specifically to look for these signs and report back, giving them a meaningful role in this difficult time. Practical cooperation intensified during late winter. Villages might organize communal meals that pooled remaining resources, ensuring everyone got at least some nourishment. Cooking together saved fuel and made simple ingredients stretch further through shared preparation techniques. Foods normally saved for emergencies came into use during these final winter weeks. Many families kept small reserves of their very best preserved foods, perhaps honey, dried fruits, or special preserved meats, specifically for this hungry time. Sharing these precious reserves became a powerful demonstration of community trust and solidarity. Knowledge of emergency foods, passed down through generations, became crucial when regular supplies ran low. Villagers knew which tree barks could be ground into flour supplements, which early plants were edible before others appeared, and how to prepare foods from parts normally not eaten, like making soup from bones that had already been used multiple times. The hungry gap affected different community members differently. Growing children, pregnant women, and those doing physical winter work needed more nutrition than others. Villages developed systems for directing limited food resources to those with greatest need, understanding that keeping the most vulnerable healthy benefited everyone. Community leaders took active roles in managing both resources and morale during this challenging time. They might organize work projects that gave people purposeful activity while taking their minds off hunger. They would remind everyone of past difficult winters, that the village had survived, building confidence that this one too would end. Religious observances took on heightened meaning. Late winter coincided with Lent in the Christian calendar, a period of intentional fasting and spiritual reflection. Churches framed the natural scarcity of late winter as an opportunity for spiritual growth, helping people find meaning in their hunger rather than just suffering through it. Special attention was paid to supporting mothers of young children during late winter. A nursing mother needed adequate nutrition to feed her baby, so neighbors might contribute small amounts from their own stores to ensure she could continue producing milk. This wasn't seen as favoritism, but as investing in the community's future through its youngest members. The bonds between different generations often grew stronger through late winter challenges. Grandparents might eat less to ensure grandchildren had enough, knowing their own lives would naturally be shorter. Young adults would work harder to find emergency foods for elderly neighbors who couldn't forage for themselves. Community storytelling during late winter often focused on themes of endurance, unexpected abundance, or reward after hardship. These stories weren't just distraction, but psychological tools that helped people maintain hope and persistence during the most difficult weeks. Some villages developed specific late winter roles. Certain individuals might be designated as food finders, people skilled at locating early spring plants, fishing through ice, or tracking winter game when little else was available. These people received community support to focus on these specialized skills when they were most needed. When spring finally arrived, communities celebrated with genuine joy and relief. The first feast with fresh spring greens marked the official end of winter's grip. These celebrations acknowledged not just the return of easier times, but the community's success in supporting each other through the hardest season. After surviving a winter together, village bonds were often strengthened. Shared hardship created connections that lasted throughout the year. Families remembered who had helped them during difficult times and looked for opportunities to repay that support during seasons of greater abundance. The experience of winters past shaped how communities prepared for future ones. After particularly difficult years, villagers might decide to increase communal storage, develop new preservation methods, or plant different crops that had proven more reliable during scarcity. Looking back at medieval community winter support systems shows us something important about human survival. While we often focus on practical techniques like food preservation or warm clothing, equally important were the social systems that ensured resources were shared, knowledge was passed down, and no one faced winter's challenges alone. These community bonds weren't just nice additions to survival strategies, they were essential components. A family might have all the technical skills for winter survival, but still perish if isolated from community support during an unexpected challenge, like illness, injury, or crop failure. Modern archaeological evidence from places like Warren, Percy shows that medieval villages that maintained strong community structures generally had better health outcomes than those with weaker social bonds. The physical remains of villages tell stories of shared resources, recovered injuries that would have required others' help, and generally fewer signs of severe malnutrition than we might expect. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval winter community support wasn't its existence, but its persistence. Through centuries of challenges, including climate fluctuations, political changes, and plagues, the basic structures of village cooperation remained remarkably stable. Communities passed down not just practical skills, but social technologies for working together during winter's greatest challenges. This social wisdom represents one of the most important ways medieval people survived winter after winter, generation after generation. The practical knowledge of food preservation, clothing production, and heating methods was embedded within a broader community knowledge of how to maintain cooperation, resolve conflicts, and ensure that limited resources helped everyone survive. Until spring. As we've explored the various aspects of medieval winter survival, from food storage to clothing, heating, healthcare, and community support, we've seen how these elements work together as an integrated system. No single strategy was enough on its own. Survival depended on the combination of practical techniques and social cooperation. Our next story will look at another important aspect of winter survival: how people brought light into the darkness of long winter nights. What methods did they use to illuminate their cottages? How did they manage precious lighting resources during the season, when darkness lasted longest? When the sun sets early on winter afternoons in Northern Europe, darkness falls quickly. Today, we simply flip a switch and electric lights instantly push back the night. But for people in medieval villages like Warren Percy, fighting the winter, darkness took planning, resources, and careful management of precious lighting materials. The most basic source of light in a medieval cottage was the hearth fire itself. The central fire that provided warmth also cast a reddish-orange glow throughout the single-room home. This firelight was free, requiring no extra materials beyond the fuel already needed for heating. But it had major limitations. Firelight was uneven and constantly changing as flames flickered and wood shifted. It couldn't be moved to where light was needed for specific tasks. It was brightest near the center of the room and faded to deep shadows in the corners. And as the fire burned down for the night, the light diminished too. Despite these limitations, firelight played a crucial role in winter lighting. Families arranged their evening activities around the hearth, gathering close to both the warmth and light. They positioned their most light-dependent tasks where the glow was strongest and saved less detailed work for the dimmer areas. The timing of activities was planned around light availability. During the short winter days, outdoor work was done during daylight hours whenever possible. Indoor tasks requiring good light might be scheduled for midday, when sunlight coming through open doorways or shutters could supplement the fire glow. To extend usable light beyond the fire itself, medieval people developed various portable lighting methods. The simplest was the rushlight, an inexpensive lighting source made from the pithy core of rush plants, similar to cattails, that grow in marshy areas. Making rushlights was typically summer or fall work, preparing for winter's darkness. Children and women would gather rushes from wetlands, then peel off most of the green outer covering, leaving just a thin strip to provide strength. The exposed white pith was dried thoroughly, then soaked in leftover cooking fat, usually animal fat like tallow from sheep or cattle. Once dried again, these rushlights could be burned by placing them in a special holder that gripped one end, leaving the fat-soaked rush to burn slowly. A typical rushlight might burn for 15-30 minutes, not long by our standards, but enough time to complete a specific task requiring light. Rushlights weren't very bright, perhaps equivalent to a small candle, but they had the advantage of being essentially free for peasant families who could gather rushes and had access to animal fat. Most households made dozens or even hundreds of rushlights during preparation seasons to have enough for winter months. For slightly better light, families might use tallow candles. These were made from the same animal fat used for rushlights, but formed into candles using wicks made of twisted linen or cotton. Making tallow candles was an important fall activity, often done communally, so everyone could share in the work. The process started during autumn slaughter, when fat from animals was carefully collected and rendered, melted and strained, to create clean tallow. Then came candle-making day, when wicks were repeatedly dipped into the melted tallow, building up layers until proper candle thickness was achieved. Alternatively, tallow might be poured into simple molds around wicks. Tallow candles provided more light than rushlights but had significant drawbacks. They smoked, smelled unpleasant as they burned and dripped. The smell came from the animal fat itself. Imagine the smell of beef or mutton fat burning in your home for hours. This wasn't as noticeable in medieval cottages already filled with cooking smells and smoke from the hearth, but it was still a downside. Despite these drawbacks, tallow candles were the main light source beyond the fire for most peasant families. They were made in various sizes, with larger ones saved for important occasions and smaller ones for everyday needs. A typical household might make dozens of candles during slaughter season, carefully storing them in cool, dry places until needed. Beeswax. Candles represented a significant step up in lighting quality. They burned cleaner, brighter, and with a pleasant honey scent rather than the greasy smell of tallow. They also dripped less and lasted longer. But beeswax was expensive and generally beyond the means of ordinary peasants. The church used beeswax, candles for religious services, seeing the product of the industrious, pure bees as symbolically appropriate for worship. Monasteries often kept beehives specifically for candle production. In wealthy homes, beeswax candles might be used for special occasions or when important visitors came. For most peasant families, however, beeswax candles were rarely, if ever, used. Oil lamps provided another lighting option, though they were less common in northern Europe than in Mediterranean regions where olive oil was plentiful. In places like Warren Percy, oil lamps might burn animal fat or occasionally fish oil in coastal regions. These lamps were simple clay or metal containers with a wick floating in the oil or drawn up along the side. Like tallow candles, these oil lamps could be smoky and smelly, but they sometimes provided more consistent light. They were most likely to be used for specific tasks requiring longer periods of steady light rather than general household illumination. For peasant families, winter lighting required careful management of limited resources. Light was not taken for granted or used wastefully. A single candle might be lit for a specific purpose, then extinguished when that task was complete. Multiple family members would gather around one light source rather than using several lights in different areas. Reflective surfaces helped maximize available light. Some households had polished metal surfaces that could be positioned to reflect and amplify light from a single candle or rushlight. Even a basin of water could serve as a reflector when placed strategically near a light source. The amount of artificial light used varied by the lunar cycle. During the full moon, families took advantage of moonlight coming through windows or doors. Some activities requiring better visibility might be scheduled for these brighter nights, saving precious candles or rushlights for the darker times of the month. Different winter activities required different levels of light. For spinning wool, a common winter evening task, feeling the fibers was as important as seeing them, so relatively low light was acceptable. For detailed needlework or fine repair work, better light was needed, so these tasks might be done sitting nearest to the light source or during daylight hours. Children played important roles in managing winter lighting. They might be responsible for making rush lights during preparation seasons, for keeping candles trimmed as they burned, removing charred bits of wick to maintain better flame, or for adjusting the hearth fire to provide more light when needed. For specific tasks, the limited light of winter evenings shaped how people spent their time. Activities that could be done largely by touch or with minimal vision, like some types of wood carving, wool carding, or storytelling, became winter evening specialties. Work requiring fine detail or color discrimination might be set aside until spring brought longer daylight hours. But how did the experience of these dimly lit winter evenings affect medieval people psychologically? How did communities come together to share both light resources and the activities that took place by flickering candle flames? The psychological impact of winter's extended darkness was significant for medieval people. Unlike us, they couldn't instantly banish darkness with electric lights. Darkness was a presence they lived with for many hours each day during winter, a time when the boundaries between the known world and the mysterious shadows grew thin. This extended darkness affected how people felt and behaved. The natural human tendency towards sleep when it's dark meant winter evenings often brought drowsiness earlier than in summer. Medieval people generally adapted their sleep patterns to the seasons, often going to bed earlier in winter and practicing what some historians call segmented sleep. This segmented sleep pattern involved going to bed not long after sunset, sleeping for several hours, first sleep, then waking for an hour or two in the middle of the night before returning to a second sleep until dawn. During the middle waking period, people might talk quietly, pray, think, or even visit neighbors briefly. This pattern was considered normal rather than a form of insomnia. The darkness also sparked creativity in storytelling. Winter evenings were prime times for sharing tales, with firelight or candlelight creating the perfect atmosphere for stories about heroes, saints, monsters, and magical happenings. The shadows at the edges of the light seemed to make such stories more vivid, more possible. These storytelling sessions weren't just entertainment, they were essential for passing down community history, practical knowledge, moral lessons, and cultural values. Children absorbed their heritage during these dark winter evenings, listening to tales that had been shared for generations. The limited light created natural gathering points within and between households. Inside a cottage, family members would cluster near the best light source rather than spreading throughout the space. This physical closeness encouraged conversation, shared work, and stronger bonds. People simply spent more time in direct contact with each other during winter evenings. Between households, lighting resources often inspired visiting patterns. Neighbors might gather in one cottage some evenings to share the light from one fire and a few candles, then move to another home on different nights. This rotation spread the cost of lighting among multiple families while creating regular social connections. Light itself took on symbolic and spiritual meaning during the darkest season. Many winter religious festivals across different cultures centered around light themes, candles, bonfires, or lanterns that represented hope, divine presence, or the promised return of the sun. These celebrations provided psychological comfort during the darkest days. In Christian traditions, Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, featured increasing light as candles were progressively lit on Advent wreaths. Candlemas on February 2nd marked the midpoint of winter, with church ceremonies blessing candles for the year ahead. These rituals connected physical light with spiritual light in ways that helped people find meaning in the winter darkness. The limited artificial light of winter evenings also meant that people experienced darkness more fully than we typically do today. On cloudy nights, when neither moonlight nor starlight penetrated, the darkness outside could be profound. This deep darkness shaped how people thought about night, as a time fundamentally different from day, with its own rules and dangers. For safety and practical reasons, most people limited their activities after sunset to their immediate households or very nearby neighbors. Traveling at night, especially during winter, was avoided whenever possible. The few who did need to move, about at night, like midwives called to births or priests visiting the dying, often carried lanterns. These lanterns were typically made with thin pieces of horn, parchment, or oiled cloth that protected candles from wind while allowing some light to shine through. They were precious possessions, carefully maintained, and often handed down through generations of a family or professional group like village healers. Winter's darkness also affected how indoor spaces were arranged and used. Activity areas requiring better light would be positioned near windows that could admit daylight during the short days. The space nearest the hearth served multiple purposes: cooking, area by day, primary living and working space by evening, with sleeping areas often located in the dimmer periphery of the room. Different social classes experienced winter lighting very differently. While peasants relied mainly on rushlights and tallow candles, nobles and wealthy merchants might have dozens of beeswax candles burning simultaneously during winter feasts or gatherings. This abundance of light was not just practical, but a display of wealth and status, a way of demonstrating that even darkness bent to their resources. Monasteries developed particular approaches to winter lighting, with their need for light for reading religious texts and copying manuscripts. They invested significant resources in quality lighting. Many monastic rules specified the exact amounts of light to be provided at different times and for different purposes. The role of circator in some monasteries included checking that candles were properly extinguished when not needed, an early form of energy conservation. The transition from autumn to deep winter brought changes in lighting practices. As winter solstice approached and days grew shorter, families might become more conservative with lighting resources, knowing the longest nights were still ahead. After solstice, as days slowly lengthened again, lighting might be used a bit more generously, celebrating the gradual return of natural light. Communities sometimes coordinated their use of light for special winter events. A village might decide to use extra candles for a midwinter celebration, with each family contributing to create a brighter than usual gathering in the church or a large household. These rare moments of abundant light stood out as special occasions against the background of typical winter dimness. Children's experience of winter darkness had educational aspects. They learned to navigate familiar spaces with minimal light, developing strong spatial memory and awareness. They practiced identifying things by touch, sound, and smell, rather than sight alone. These skills would serve them throughout lives lived without constant artificial light. Young people also learned the critical winter skill of fire maintenance. How to bank a fire at night so it would last until morning. How to nurse nearly dead embers back to flames, and how to manage precious lighting resources. By the time they were teenagers, most could handle all aspects of fire and light management, skills essential for eventual independent households. The gradual transition towards spring brought not just more daylight, but changes in the quality of light. The low, golden winter sun gave way to higher, brighter spring light that penetrated deeper into cottages. People noticed and celebrated these subtle changes, much as they had marked the decline of light in autumn, but now with growing optimism. But what specific activities occupied people during these long, dimly lit winter evenings? How did they make productive use of hours that couldn't be spent on outdoor work? And how did the limited light shapes the crafts and skills developed during winter's indoor season? The long winter evenings illuminated by firelight, candles, and rushlights became a special time for activities that couldn't fit into the busy outdoor work seasons. Far from being idle, medieval villages filled these hours with productive handicrafts, educational moments, entertainment, and social bonding, all adapted to the low light conditions. Textile work dominated many winter evenings. Women spun wool into yarn using drop spindles or spinning wheels, a task that could be done largely by feel once the basic skills were mastered. The rhythmic movements of spinning didn't require bright light, making it perfect for the dimly lit hours. A good spinner could produce many yards of yarn during a single winter evening. After spinning came other textile processes. Men and women both participated in weaving on home looms during winter months. While setting up a loom required good light, the actual weaving process could continue into the evening once the pattern was established. The steady thumping of the loom's beater became part of the soundtrack of winter nights. Clothing repair and production filled many evening hours. Families mended worn garments, turned adult clothes into children's sizes, and created new items for the year ahead. Simple sewing could be done in low light, while more detailed work might be positioned closest to the candle or fire. Woodworking suited the winter evenings, particularly projects that didn't require precise measurement or fine detail. Men carved spoons, bowls, and other household items, often working largely by touch and using the firelight to check progress occasionally. The gentle scraping sound of knives on wood accompanied evening conversations. Children learned crucial skills during these evening work sessions. Young girls practiced spinning with smaller spindles, beginning with coarser yarns that didn't require perfect tension. Boys might try simple wood carving under a father's or uncle's guidance. These informal apprenticeships happened naturally as families worked together by firelight. Tool maintenance filled many winter hours. Farming implements needed cleaning, sharpening, and repair during the off-season. Metal parts were oiled to prevent rust. Wooden handles were smoothed and checked for cracks. This work could be done gradually over many evenings, with each tool given proper attention without the rush that came during farming seasons. Food processing continued even after harvest was complete. Winter evenings might find families shelling nuts gathered in autumn, sorting dried beans to remove any that had spoiled, or processing preserved foods for immediate consumption. These repetitive tasks suited the low light and could be done while participating in conversation or listening to stories. Some households practiced specialized winter crafts that brought in additional resources. Basket making used materials gathered and prepared earlier in the year, with the actual weaving of baskets done during winter evenings. Rope making, using homegrown flax or hemp fibers, was another common winter evening activity that required more feel than sight. Certain tasks were specifically scheduled for the brightest nights of the lunar month. When the full moon shone through windows or open doorways, its light might be enough for more detailed work like fine embroidery, detail carving, or tasks involving color discrimination. Families kept track of the moon's phases and planned accordingly. Knowledge transfer became formalized during winter evenings. Older community members shared specific skills with younger generations, teaching songs, prayers, medicinal recipes, or farming techniques through oral instruction. These teaching sessions had probably happened for thousands of years in much the same way, with knowledge passing from one generation to the next by firelight. Mathematical skills were practiced through practical applications and games. Children learned to calculate quantities for recipes, field plantings, or cloth production. Simple board games using pebbles or carved pieces taught strategic thinking while providing entertainment. These educational activities required minimal light and helped develop mental skills needed for adult responsibilities. Music played an important role in winter evenings. Simple instruments like wooden flutes, small drums, or stringed instruments might be played while others worked or just listened. Singing required no light at all and helped pass the time during repetitive tasks. Many villages had particularly skilled musicians who might be invited to different homes throughout winter to share their talents. Storytelling reached its peak during winter evenings. The combination of many gathered listeners, limited light, creating a mysterious atmosphere, and hours to fill made conditions perfect for elaborate tales. Different types of stories filled different needs, practical tales teaching moral lessons for children, humorous stories lightening the winter mood, or epic narratives continued over many evenings. Some villages had especially gifted storytellers who could recite tales lasting hours, sometimes continuing the same story over multiple evenings. These individuals held important cultural roles, preserving community history and values through their narratives. Their performances were highly valued winter entertainment. Religious devotion filled part of many winter evenings. Families might recite prayers together, discuss Sunday's sermon, or read from a prayer book if they were fortunate enough to own one and have sufficient light for reading. These spiritual practices provided structure and meaning during the dark months while reinforcing community values. Planning for the coming agricultural year took place during winter evenings. Families discussed which crops to plant where, when, to breed animals, or whether to try new farming techniques. These conversations included children, helping them understand the rhythm of agricultural life and preparing them for their future roles. Special winter-only social gatherings emerged in many communities. In some regions, groups of women gathered for kveldvaka, evening wake, or similar traditions, where they would work on handicrafts together while taking turns reading aloud or telling stories. These gatherings specifically utilized the dark evenings for both productive work and social connection. Village news and information spread during evening visits between households. Without newspapers or other formal information sources, these personal exchanges kept everyone informed about births, deaths, illnesses, approaching travelers, weather predictions, or news from nearby communities brought by merchants or pilgrims. The limited light also created space for reflection and introspection. With fewer visual distractions than we experience today, people had more opportunity for deep thought, prayer, or simply sitting quietly with their own thoughts. This contemplative aspect of winter evenings may have provided psychological benefits we rarely experience in our brightly lit modern world. As winter progressed towards spring, the evening's activities would gradually shift. By late winter, preparations for spring planting became more urgent. Seeds would be sorted and checked, planting schedules finalized, and tools made ready for the first opportunity to work the soil. The conversation might turn more frequently to the coming growing season as daylight hours slowly increased. Looking back at these winter evening activities shows us something important. The limited light wasn't seen primarily as a hardship, but simply as the natural condition for this time of year. People adapted their activities to the light available, developing skills and traditions specifically suited to the winter evening environment. The winter evening, with its gentle illumination from fire and candles, its gathered family members working together, and its rich traditions of storytelling and skill sharing, represented a special time that connected medieval people to both their immediate community and to countless generations before them who had passed winter evenings in much the same way. Our next story will explore how medieval people kept busy with indoor crafts and projects throughout the winter months, making productive use of time when fieldwork was impossible and preparing crucial items for the year ahead. When snow covered the fields and ice crusted over streams, medieval villagers couldn't work outdoors as they did during warmer months. But this didn't mean they were idle. Winter was a busy season of indoor productivity, with specialized crafts and projects that were essential for the coming year. The winter months offered precious time to create, repair, and prepare items that would be needed when outdoor work resumed. In the village of Warren-Percy, as in thousands of other medieval communities, winter crafts weren't just hobbies or ways to pass time. They were necessary work that kept the cycle of rural life turning. Almost every household engaged in multiple craft activities, with different family members specializing in various tasks based on age, gender, and personal skills. Woodcraft was particularly important during winter. With agricultural tools at rest, men had time to repair existing items and create new ones. Broken plough handles, damaged cart parts, or worn tool handles could receive careful attention. A plough missing a piece or a broken rake would be useless. When spring came, so these repairs couldn't wait. Beyond repairs, winter was the time for creating new wooden items. Household utensils like spoons, bowls, cups, and plates were carved from suitable pieces of wood. These weren't rough temporary items, but carefully crafted objects meant to last for years. A well-made wooden bowl might be used by a family for a decade or more before needing replacement. The tools for woodworking were relatively simple, but required skill to use effectively. Most households had at least a few knives of different sizes, perhaps an axe, a simple hand drill, and various scraping tools. These basic implements, combined with knowledge passed down through generations, were enough to create most needed wooden items. Different woods were chosen for different purposes, based on their properties. Oak's hardness made it good for structural pieces that needed strength. Ash was preferred for tool handles because of its shock-absorbing qualities. Fruit woods like apple or cherry were favored for items that would contact food, as they imparted no bitter taste. Even the humble willow, easy to work when green, found uses in temporary items or basket making. Children were gradually introduced to woodworking skills appropriate to their age and strength. A young boy might start by helping to sand smooth a spoon his father had carved, then progress to carving simple items himself as he grew older. By the time a young man reached adulthood, he would have spent many winter evenings developing these essential skills. Basket making occupied many winter hours and used materials gathered and prepared during warmer seasons. Thin, flexible stems of willow, hazel, or other pliable woods had been collected, then soaked to maintain their flexibility. During winter, these prepared materials were woven into baskets of various sizes and shapes for specific purposes. Some baskets were made for gathering, sturdy containers with handles for collecting berries, eggs, or vegetables. Others were designed for storage of particular items, perhaps loosely woven for onions and garlic that needed air circulation, or tightly woven for holding smaller items like sewing supplies. Special flat baskets served as sieves for flour or grain, while deep baskets might hold fleece during wool processing. Like woodworking, basket-making skills were passed down through families and refined over years of practice. Children would begin with simple weaving patterns before progressing to more complex designs. A skilled basket maker could create containers that were not just functional but beautiful, with decorative patterns woven into their structures. Rope making was another important winter craft. Using flax, hemp, or other fiber plants grown during summer, families would process the raw materials into usable fibers, then twist them into ropes of various thicknesses. These ropes would be needed throughout the year for everything from animal harnesses to well buckets to securing items during transport. The process of rope making often required space to work, with simple devices to hold one end of the developing rope while the maker twisted the fibers together. In some communities, rope making became a specialized winter activity practiced by certain families who had particular skill or the right equipment, while other households might trade goods or services for finished rope. Leatherwork filled many winter hours, using hides saved from autumn slaughter. The initial processing of hides, removing hair, tanning, and basic preparation, was usually done soon after slaughter, but the creation of leather items continued throughout winter. Families made or repaired shoes, belts, straps for tools, pouches for carrying small items, and various harness parts for working animals. The most basic leatherwork could be done with simple tools: knives for cutting, awls for making holes, and sturdy needles with linen or sinew thread for sewing pieces together. More specialized tools might be shared among households or owned by village members who had particular skill with leatherwork. Shoes were among the most important leather items made during winter. A good pair of well-fitted leather shoes was essential for working in fields, forests, or anywhere outside the home. Most peasants owned just 1 or 2 pairs of shoes, which needed to last as long as possible with repairs. Winter provided time to carefully create new shoes, or thoroughly repair existing ones before the busy outdoor work seasons returned. Children's shoes presented a particular challenge, as young feet grew quickly. Families might make somewhat oversized shoes that could be stuffed with straw until the child grew into them, or they might design shoes with adjustable fastenings that could accommodate some growth. Hand-me-downs from older siblings were common, often receiving extensive repairs during winter months to prepare them for their next wearer. Metal repair while not a craft that every household could practice due to the specialized tools and skills required, was vital winter work in medieval villages. The local blacksmith, if the village was fortunate enough to have one, would be busy throughout winter repairing and creating metal items needed for the coming year. Farmers would bring their metal tools, plowshares, scythes, sickles, and knives to be repaired or sharpened. The smith might create new metal items needed for specific spring projects. Payment often came in the form of goods or services rather than money, with the blacksmith receiving food, fuel, or help with his own fields, in exchange for his specialized work. In villages without a resident blacksmith, traveling smiths might make winter rounds, staying in each community for a few days to handle essential repairs before moving on to the next village. These visits became important social occasions as well as practical necessities, with news and stories exchanged alongside the repair services. But what about crafts more specifically associated with women's work? How did textile production, food processing, and household management fill the winter hours? And how did these indoor activities connect families to the wider community during the snowbound months? Textile production dominated winter work for women and girls, involving multiple stages that transformed raw fibers into finished cloth and garments. This work wasn't just for a single season. It created the clothes, bedding, and household textiles that families would use for years to come. The process typically began with wool that had been sheared from sheep the previous spring or summer. By winter, this wool had been washed to remove dirt and lanolin, the natural oils from the sheep, but it still needed extensive processing before it could become clothing. Carding was often the first winter textile task. Using two paddle-like tools covered with small metal teeth, cards, women and older children would draw the wool between them repeatedly, aligning the fibers and removing any remaining tangles or debris. This transformed the clumpy, disorganized wool into soft, fluffy bats ready for spinning. Even young children could help with simple carding once they reached about 6 or 7 years old. The work required minimal strength, but did demand patience and attention. Children typically started with smaller amounts of wool, gradually taking on more as their skills and endurance increased. After carding came spinning, the process of drawing out and twisting the fibers to create yarn. This was traditionally done using a drop spindle, a simple tool with a weighted end that helped maintain tension and twist as fibers were drawn out. Later in the medieval period, spinning wheels appeared in some regions, allowing faster production, but spindles remained common, especially among poorer households. Spinning was continuous winter work. Almost any moment when a woman's hands weren't occupied with cooking or other tasks might find her with spindle in hand, adding to the household's yarn supply. It could be done in low light and combined easily with conversation, storytelling, or supervising children, making it ideal for winter evenings. Girls learned spinning young, usually beginning around age 5 or 6 with easier fibers and thicker yarns. By their teenage years, most could produce fine, even threads suitable for weaving delicate fabrics. The quality of a young woman's spinning was considered an important skill that reflected on her value as a potential wife and household manager. Once enough yarn had been spun, weaving began. In most peasant households, weaving took place on simple, upright or horizontal looms. Setting up the loom, arranging the long warp threads that formed the foundation of the cloth, required good light and careful attention. This part of the process might be done near a window during daylight hours. The actual weaving, passing the shuttle, carrying the weft thread over and under the warp threads, could continue into evening hours once the pattern was established. Weaving created the fabric that would eventually become clothing, bedding, towels, and other household textiles. The width of cloth was limited by the size of the household loom, with wider fabrics requiring larger, more expensive equipment. In some villages, weaving became a specialized activity, with certain households having larger looms capable of producing wider or more complex cloth. Families might bring their spun yarn to these weavers, paying for the service with food, fuel, or other goods. This specialization allowed for more efficient use of equipment and skills within the community. After, weaving came the creation of actual garments and household items. Cutting valuable cloth was a serious responsibility. A mistake could waste material that had taken months to produce. The most experienced household member usually handled cutting, with careful planning to use every scrap efficiently. Sewing occupied many winter hours, using bone, wood, or metal needles with thread spun from flax, linen thread, or wool. Women and older girls created and repaired clothing for the entire family. New garments were often made from cloth woven during the current winter, while repairs extended the life of existing items. The basic clothing items remained relatively consistent for centuries: tunics, leggings, simple dresses, head coverings, and cloaks or mantles for outdoor wear. Styles changed very slowly compared to modern fashion, with the same basic patterns used for generations. What might change were small details in decoration, the quality of the fabric, or minor adaptations to the basic forms. Clothing was designed for longevity and adaptability. Children's garments included extra material that could be let out as they grew. Adult clothing was made to accommodate weight fluctuations that naturally occurred between seasons of plenty and scarcity. When clothing eventually wore out beyond repair, the fabric would be cut up and reused for smaller items, patches, or even as stuffing for mattresses. Embroidery and decorative needlework might add touches of beauty to otherwise plain garments. These decorations often appeared on visible areas like collars, cuffs, or headwear. Even humble households might include some decorative work, especially on items for special occasions or church wear. These embellishments used techniques passed down through generations, with regional styles developing distinctive patterns and motifs. While women and girls focused on textile work, food processing continued throughout winter. The preparation of preserved foods for immediate consumption required daily attention. Dried beans needed soaking. Salt meat required careful washing to remove excess salt before cooking. And preserved vegetables were incorporated into the limited winter diet. Special winter food projects included making candles and soap, both typically using tallow, animal fat, saved from autumn slaughter. Candle making we've already discussed in our story about light, but soap production was another important winter task that provided essential supplies for the coming year. Soap making combined tallow with lye, created by running water through saved wood ashes, in careful proportions. The resulting soap was used for everything from laundry to personal cleaning to washing dishes. While harsh by modern standards, this homemade soap was essential for maintaining hygiene and removing stubborn dirt from work clothes. The winter months also provided time for deeper cleaning of household items that got heavy use. Wooden tableware might receive thorough scrubbing with sand to remove embedded dirt. Cooking pots were scoured with special attention to burned areas. Bedding too heavy or bulky to wash frequently during busy seasons might receive winter laundering on days when weather permitted drying. For households with access to flax or hemp, winter included processing these plants into fibers for linen production. The plants would have been harvested in summer, then retted, partially rotted, to begin breaking down the woody parts. During winter, the retted plants were broken using special tools that cracked the stems, then scutched, beaten to remove more woody material, and finally hackled, combed to separate the long fibers. This process created the raw material for spinning linen thread, which would be used for sewing, making rope, or weaving into cloth for summer garments and household items like towels. Linen production involved specialized skills and tools, with knowledge often concentrated in certain families who would process flax for others in the community. The indoor work of winter wasn't just about creating physical items. It also included planning, teaching, and knowledge transfer that couldn't happen during the busy growing seasons. Older family members took time to teach specialized skills to younger generations. Family stories and histories were shared, keeping alive the memory of ancestors and important events. Planning for the coming agricultural year became increasingly important as winter progressed. Seeds saved from the previous harvest were checked and counted. Field rotations were discussed, with decisions made about which crops would go where based on soil conditions and the previous year's plantings. Agreements with neighbors about shared resources or work exchanges were negotiated during winter visits. But how did all this indoor productivity connect to the wider community beyond individual households? How did winter crafts contribute to village cohesion and identity during the months when people were most physically separated by weather conditions? Winter craft work, while often taking place within individual households, created important connections between families and strengthened the village's social fabric. Various customs and practices ensured that even during the most isolated winter periods, crafts became opportunities for community interaction rather than solitary pursuits. Work gatherings called by different names in various regions, bees, sittings, or workings, brought people together to accomplish larger tasks while sharing company. A family might host a wool-working gathering where neighbors would help with carding or spinning their wool. In return, they would attend similar events at other homes, creating a rotation of work sharing throughout winter. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond just getting work done. They were important social occasions during a season when isolation could affect mental well-being. They provided opportunities for young people to meet and get to know each other under appropriate supervision. They allowed for the exchange of news, techniques, and community problem solving in an informal setting. Certain winter crafts particularly lent themselves to community work parties. Quilting, the creation of bed covers from fabric pieces with batting between layers, often became a group activity with multiple people working on the same large piece. A quilting frame might be set up in the largest available space, with several women working simultaneously to create the small, even stitches that held the layers together. Similarly, larger weaving projects might bring people together. A particularly wide piece of cloth requiring a specialized loom could become a community project, with different households contributing labor at various stages. The finished cloth might then be divided among participants or used for a community purpose. Specialized knowledge moved between households through these winter gatherings. Someone who had developed a particularly effective technique for a craft process would demonstrate it for others. New patterns, designs, or methods brought to the village by travelers would be shared and incorporated into local traditions. The social aspects of craft work were especially important for integrating newcomers into the community. A new bride who had moved to her husband's village, for instance, would learn local craft variations and styles through winter work gatherings, while also contributing techniques from her home community, leading to gradual evolution of craft. Traditions. Winter crafts also created formal and informal apprenticeship systems. Children with particular aptitude for specific crafts might spend time in other households, learning from adults with special skills. A boy showing talent for wood carving might visit a neighbor known for fine work. A girl with good coordination might learn more advanced weaving techniques from a skilled neighbor. These informal learning arrangements strengthened community bonds across family lines and age groups. They ensured specialized knowledge wasn't lost if a particular family had no children, or if their children didn't show aptitude for the family craft. They created mentor relationships that often lasted for years, providing guidance beyond just craft skills. Trading of craft items and services became an important part of the winter economy. A family particularly skilled at basket making might trade their baskets for wool, spun by neighbors with good spinning skills. Someone who made excellent leather shoes might exchange them for well-crafted wooden bowls. These exchanges allowed for specialization while ensuring everyone had access to necessary items. Community craft standards emerged through these interactions. While not formally codified, shared expectations about the quality, appearance, and functionality of craft items developed over time. People knew what constituted a good basket, a proper length of rope, or a well-made wooden spoon, according to local standards. These standards weren't just about aesthetics, they related directly to functionality and durability. A poorly made basket wouldn't hold a harvest. An improperly cured leather strap might break at a crucial moment during fieldwork. The community's collective knowledge set benchmarks that helped ensure items would serve their intended purposes. Winter crafts also connected communities to wider regional identities and trading networks. Distinctive local styles in textiles, woodwork, or basket patterns marked items as coming from particular areas. When these items were traded at seasonal markets or carried by traveling merchants, they spread the reputation of communities known for quality work. Certain villages became known for specific craft specialties, perhaps especially fine wool cloth, distinctive carved items, or particularly strong baskets. This reputation could bring economic advantages through trade and create pride in local traditions. Winter months, when these specialties were primarily produced, thus contributed directly to a village's wider identity and prosperity. Religious observances intertwined with winter craft production. Many items were created specifically for church use or religious celebrations. Special candles for Candlemas, new clothes for Easter, or decorative items for local saints' feast days. Craftwork thus connected to the spiritual calendar that gave structure to medieval life. The church sometimes organized specific craft activities during winter. Monasteries might commission textiles, wooden items, or other goods from villages in their region, providing both income and purpose to winter work. Parish projects like creating altar cloths or church decorations could bring people together across usual social divisions. Winter crafts also provided opportunities for creativity and personal expression within the constraints of traditional forms. While the basic shapes and functions of items remained consistent, individual makers might add small decorative touches or slight variations that made their work distinctive. These personal touches brought satisfaction beyond the purely practical value of completing necessary tasks. Children's integration into craft work happened gradually and naturally during winter months. Rather than formal or abstract education, they learned through observation, small contributions, and progressively more complex participation. This apprenticeship model ensured practical skills passed between generations while building children's confidence and place in the community. By late winter, many households would have accumulated impressive amounts of finished craft items, piles of spun yarn, lengths of woven cloth, new or repaired tools, baskets, rope, candles, and other essentials for the coming year. These physical results of months of indoor work represented security for the future and successful use of the winter season. As spring approached, craft activities began transitioning toward outdoor preparation. The last weeks of winter might find people creating specialized tools needed for specific spring tasks: egg-gathering baskets, containers for carrying seeds to fields, or small cloth bags for holding early harvests of spring herbs and plants. Looking back at medieval winter crafts reveals a sophisticated system that combined practical necessity with social connection, knowledge transfer, economic exchange, and creative expression. Far from being idle during snowbound months, village communities maintained remarkable productivity while strengthening the social bonds that would support them through the coming agricultural seasons. These winter craftworks connected people, not just to their immediate community, but to past and future generations who practiced the same skills. When a medieval person spun wool, carved wood, or wove baskets during winter evenings, they joined a continuous human tradition stretching back countless generations and forward into futures they would never see. For us today, understanding these winter crafts offers insight into a world where people didn't just consume ready-made items, but participated directly in creating most of what they used. The winter months, rather than being a time of reduced activity, offered precious opportunities for this essential production that sustained life year-round. Our next story will explore how medieval people found food in winter forests and wild places when their stored supplies began running low. What plants remained available even under snow? What knowledge allowed them to find nourishment when fields lay dormant? How did foraging skills help bridge the gap until spring growth began? Even in the depths of winter, when fields lay under, snow and gardens stood empty, medieval people knew the forest and wild places still held food and medicine, if you knew where to look. For villagers in places like Warren Percy, venturing into winter woods wasn't just an occasional activity, but a regular practice that could supplement dwindling food stores during the leanest months. Winter foraging required specialized knowledge that had been gathered and refined over countless generations. Children began learning these skills young, following adults into the woods and learning to identify plants even in their winter forms, without the flowers or leaves that made recognition easier in summer. The winter forest might seem barren at first glance, especially to modern eyes accustomed to supermarkets providing all foods in all seasons. But medieval people saw the winter landscape differently. They recognized subtle signs of food and medicine hiding under snow, clinging to tree branches, or waiting beneath tree bark. Let's explore what a winter foraging expedition might look like for a family from Warren Percy during January or February, when stored food supplies were beginning to run low and the first spring growth still lay weeks away. The day would likely begin early, taking advantage of all available daylight. The family would dress in their warmest clothes, with special attention to footwear if snow covered the ground. They would bring simple tools, a small knife, a digging stick for rooting under snow, and containers for carrying their findings. As they entered the forest, they would immediately begin scanning for certain trees known to provide winter food. Oak trees were particularly valuable, as fallen acorns could often still be found beneath the snow. While bitter and inedible raw, due to high tannin content, acorns could be processed to remove these bitter compounds, then ground into flour that would extend limited grain supplies. The processing of acorns was time-consuming but worthwhile when other foods were scarce. After gathering, acorns would be shelled, chopped into small pieces, and soaked in several changes of water to leach out the tannins. Once the bitterness was gone, they would be dried and ground into meal that could be mixed with regular flour to make bread or added to soups and stews. Beech trees offered another winter food source. Beech nuts from the previous autumn might still be found on the forest floor. Small but nutritious, these nuts could be eaten raw or roasted. They contained valuable fats that were often lacking in late winter diets, providing concentrated energy when food supplies ran low. Hazelnut trees were carefully checked for any nuts missed during fall gathering. While most hazelnuts would have been collected when abundant, some always escaped notice, and finding even a small handful during winter was considered good fortune. These provided not just nutrition, but a welcome change in flavor during months of limited food variety. Pine trees and other conifers offered multiple winter resources. Young pine needles could be brewed into a tea rich in vitamin C, important for preventing scurvy during months when fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. This pine needle tea had a resinous flavor, but provided crucial nutrients when few other sources existed. The inner bark of certain pine species was another emergency food source. In extreme scarcity, people would carefully peel back the outer bark of selected trees without killing them to harvest some of the living inner bark. This could be dried and ground into a flour-like substance that, while not particularly tasty, provided carbohydrates and some nutrients that might make the difference between starvation and survival. Our foraging family would carefully assess trees before harvesting bark, taking only small amounts from each tree to ensure its survival. They understood their dependence on these forest resources and practiced sustainable harvesting methods passed down through generations. Moving deeper into the forest, the family might search for certain mushrooms that appeared even in winter. While most mushroom species were summer or fall fruiting, some like velvet foot mushrooms, Flammulina volutipes, and oyster mushrooms, Pleurotus austriatus, could appear during mild periods in winter, growing on dead or dying trees. Identifying winter mushrooms required expert knowledge, as mistakes could be deadly. Children would be taught from an early age which mushrooms were safe and which were poisonous, with this life or death information reinforced through stories, rhymes, and direct observation. Still, most families would rely on community members with special expertise in mushroom identification before eating any unfamiliar finds. As the family moved along streams or wet areas, they would look for watercress, Nasturtium officinale, which remains green through mild winters in some areas. This peppery plant provided rare fresh greens during winter and was rich in vitamins. Finding a patch of watercress during winter would be cause for celebration, offering both nutrition and a welcome change from preserved foods. In areas where snow had melted, or in places sheltered from the heaviest winter weather, our foraging family might find chickweed, Stellaria media, a small but nutritious plant that can grow even in cold weather. Its tender leaves could be added to soups or eaten raw, providing vitamin C and minerals often lacking in winter diets. Roots became particularly important winter forage, as many plants store nutrients underground during dormant months. The family would dig carefully through snow to locate plants they recognized by their dried stems or remaining leaves, then harvest roots like burdock, Arctium lapa, or evening primrose, Ornithera baenis. These roots required proper preparation to be palatable. Burdock roots, for instance, needed thorough cleaning and soaking to remove bitter compounds before being added to stews or roasted. The effort was worthwhile for the carbohydrates, fiber, and minerals they provided when other food sources were limited. Winter foraging wasn't just about finding food. Medicinal plants were equally important during cold months when illness spread easily. The family might collect pine resin to make salves for chest congestion, or harvest the dried seed heads of mullein, Verbascum thapsus, for tea that eased coughs. They would look for rose hips still clinging to wild rose bushes, as these bright, red fruits retain their vitamin C even when dried by winter weather. Rose hip tea not only provided crucial nutrients, but helped fight winter colds and infections. Finding a bush with unharvested rose hips was considered especially good fortune. Tree fungi like birch polypore, Fomitopsis betulina, were collected for medicinal uses. These woody growths could be dried and stored, then made into teas or tinctures for treating various ailments. Modern research has confirmed many of these fungi do indeed have antibacterial and immune-supporting properties that would have been beneficial during winter illness. But winter foraging came with special challenges and dangers. How did medieval people navigate these difficulties while still gathering crucial resources from the winter landscape? Winter foraging presented unique challenges beyond just finding plants under snow or in their dormant state. Cold temperatures, shorter daylight hours, and potentially dangerous conditions required special knowledge and preparation for those venturing into winter woods. Navigation became particularly important and more difficult during winter. Without the familiar landmarks of summer, with paths covered by snow, and with the risk of becoming disoriented in cold that could quickly become life-threatening, medieval foragers developed various methods to keep their bearings. They paid close attention to the sun's position, even on cloudy days when just a brighter spot in the sky indicated its location. They noted distinctive trees, rock formations, or changes in terrain that remained visible in winter. Many families had specific routes they followed during winter foraging, staying within areas they knew well rather than venturing into unfamiliar territory. Children were taught from an early age to recognize direction-finding signs specific to winter. The north sides of trees often had more moss or different bark patterns from the south-facing sides. Snow might melt faster on southern exposures. These subtle indicators helped prevent the dangerous situation of becoming lost in winter woods. Time management was critical during winter foraging expeditions. With daylight limited to perhaps 8 to 9 hours in northern Europe, families needed to ensure they could reach foraging areas, collect what they needed, and return home before darkness fell. They learned to estimate time without clocks, using the sun's position and their own experience of how long various activities took. Weather awareness became a survival skill. Medieval people were keen observers of weather patterns and signs of changing conditions. Before setting out on a foraging trip, they would note cloud formations, wind direction, animal behaviors, and other indicators that might predict storms or temperature drops. If these signs suggested worsening weather, they might postpone the expedition or plan a shorter trip to areas closer to home. Winter foraging required energy management as well. Moving through snow, especially if it was deep, consumed far more energy than walking on clear ground. Digging for roots or scraping snow from fallen nuts demanded additional effort. At the same time, cold temperatures increase the body's calorie needs just to maintain warmth. Families balance these energy demands by bringing small amounts of food to consume during foraging trips. Perhaps a piece of bread or dried meat eaten midday to maintain energy levels. They also knew to pace themselves, working steadily rather than in bursts that might lead to excessive sweating, dangerous in cold as it could freeze, or exhaustion. Water needs didn't disappear in winter, despite the cold. Breathing dry winter air and the physical exertion of foraging created thirst. Some people carried small containers of water, while others knew safe techniques for melting snow, which requires surprising amounts of energy, or finding unfrozen water sources. Protective clothing was essential for winter foraging. We've already discussed winter garments in an earlier story, but specific adaptations help those spending hours in forests during cold weather. Extra wrappings around feet and hands protected extremities most vulnerable to frostbite. Layers that could be adjusted during exertion and rest periods helped manage body temperature. The social dimension of winter foraging was important for both safety and efficiency. Rarely would a single person venture into winter woods alone. Instead, small groups worked together, combining knowledge and physical capabilities. Older children might be paired with adults to learn techniques while providing additional eyes. For spotting resources, different age groups contributed in various ways. Younger adults might handle the heavy work of digging through frozen ground or breaking trail through deep snow. Older people, even if physically less strong, provided crucial expertise about where to look for specific plants and how to identify them in their winter state. Children were often best at spotting small items like nuts or berries that their lower height and keen eyesight made more visible to them. Winter foraging wasn't random wandering, but followed seasonal knowledge about where different resources were most likely to be found. South-facing slopes that received more sun might have plants still green when north-facing areas were dormant. Areas where wind had blown snow clear might expose fallen nuts or seeds. Low-lying areas near water often harbored plants that remained accessible even in cold weather. This knowledge of winter microenvironments was highly local and specific. A family might know exactly which bend in a particular stream still had watercress growing in January, or which cluster of oaks tended to produce acorns that were less bitter than others. This detailed environmental knowledge represented generations of observation and experience. Winter foraging often involved what we might now call vertical foraging, looking not just on the ground, but at multiple levels in the environment. Certain lichens growing on tree branches provided emergency food. Bird nests from the previous summer might still contain forgotten seeds. Tree cavities sometimes held nuts stored by squirrels or other animals that human foragers could harvest. This three-dimensional approach to finding food required careful observation skills and knowledge of the habits of various forest creatures. Medieval people understood the complex relationships between plants, animals, insects, and the landscape in ways that modern people, removed from direct dependence on these systems, often don't develop. Winter foraging intertwined with beliefs and spiritual practices. Many medieval communities had customs about asking permission from forest spirits before taking resources, or leaving small offerings in return for what was gathered. Christian practices might include prayers before foraging or blessings of gathered plants. These spiritual dimensions acknowledged human dependence on natural systems beyond their control. Special foraging knowledge was needed for late winter and early spring, the time often called the hunger gap, when stored foods ran lowest, but new growth hadn't yet appeared. This period, typically February to April, depending on the region, required the most extensive foraging knowledge to bridge the gap until spring abundance. During this critical time, people looked for the very earliest spring plants, often gathering them when they were just beginning to emerge. Plants like stinging nettles, dandelions, and wild garlic might be harvested when barely visible above ground, providing crucial nutrients after months of limited diet. Some plants were particularly valued for appearing during this hunger gap. Coltsfoot, Tussilago farfara, with its bright yellow flowers sometimes pushing up through lingering snow, was gathered for both food and medicine. Its early appearance made it especially welcome as one of the first signs that the scarcity of winter would eventually end. But how did medieval communities manage these wild resources to ensure they remained available year after year? And how did knowledge about winter plants transfer between generations and adapt to changing conditions? Medieval communities didn't just harvest wild plants. They actively managed the landscape to ensure these resources would continue to be available. Their relationship with the winter forest wasn't simply extractive, but involved a complex system of care, protection, and selective intervention that we might now recognize as a form of sustainable management. Certain valuable winter forage plants were deliberately encouraged. When collecting roots like burdock or evening primrose, foragers would often replant a portion of the root or scatter seeds to ensure future growth. They might clear competing plants from around especially useful species, giving them better growing conditions. Some plants were even transplanted closer to villages for easier access during difficult winter conditions. Knowledge about sustainable harvesting was embedded in cultural practices and stories. Children learned through rhymes and sayings how much could be taken without harming future growth. Take a third, leave two-thirds was a common guideline for many plants. Stories about greedy harvesters who took too much and suffered consequences reinforced these conservation ethics. Communities developed informal but effective systems for rotating foraging areas. They might agree to leave certain sections of forest unharvested in particular years, allowing plant populations to recover. Different families often had traditional areas where they focused their foraging, spreading the impact across the wider landscape rather than concentrating it in a few easily accessible locations. These management practices extended to trees, providing winter resources. Coppicing, cutting trees to stimulate multiple new shoots from the stump, created sustainable harvests of wood while maintaining living trees that continued providing nuts, sap, or bark. Some tree species respond well to this treatment, producing straighter, more usable stems while extending the tree's overall lifespan. Pollarding, a similar practice where cuts are made higher on the trunk, above livestock browsing height, allowed for wood harvesting while preserving trees in areas where animals grazed. These carefully managed trees produced reliable harvests of materials year after year, sometimes for centuries. The knowledge required for this landscape management was detailed and localized. People understood which tree species responded well to coppicing, which plants needed protection from competition, and which grew best in particular microenvironments. This information wasn't written down, but passed through direct teaching and observation from one generation to the next. Within communities, specialized knowledge about winter plants wasn't evenly distributed. Certain individuals became recognized for their particular expertise in finding, identifying, and using specific plant resources. These plant knowledge keepers held critical information that benefited the entire community and were often sought out for training younger generations. Women often held specialized knowledge about medicinal plants available in winter. This expertise developed through their roles as primary healthcare providers for families and communities. They knew which winter plants could treat common cold weather ailments, how to prepare them properly, and how to recognize quality specimens even in their dormant state. Men might specialize in knowledge about trees and larger plants, particularly those requiring significant physical strength to harvest. They understood which trees would provide sap in late winter, which had the best inner bark for emergency food, and how to harvest these resources without killing the trees that provided them. Children received age-appropriate foraging education throughout their development. Young children might start by learning to identify the most distinctive and safe winter plants, gathering easy items like pine needles for tea. As they grew, they progressed to more complex identification challenges and harvesting techniques, requiring greater skill. By adolescence, most young people had acquired substantial knowledge about winter foraging, though they would continue learning throughout their lives. This education wasn't separate from daily life, but integrated into seasonal activities, with specific attention given to winter plants during the cold months when they were actually being gathered and used. Knowledge transfer wasn't limited to parent-child relationships. Extended family members, particularly grandparents with more time for teaching, played played crucial roles in passing down specialized information. Community experts might take particularly interested young people under their guidance, ensuring valuable knowledge continued even if their own children showed less aptitude or interest. Winter foraging knowledge connected medieval communities to specific landscapes across generations. A grandmother might take her grandchildren to exactly the same hillside where she had learned to find certain winter routes from her own grandmother decades earlier. These knowledge chains created deep ties to place that reinforced community identity and ecological understanding. This knowledge wasn't static but adaptive. When climate patterns shifted, as they did during various periods of the Middle Ages, including the medieval warm period and the beginning of the Little Ice Age, communities adjusted their foraging practices based on observed changes in plant availability and growth patterns. When new plants arrived in a region, whether through natural spread or human introduction, they were carefully evaluated for their winter uses. Successful innovations were incorporated into the community's knowledge base and shared through established teaching networks. Winter foraging connected to seasonal celebrations and religious observances. Certain plants gathered in winter had roles in medieval Christmas or Candlemas traditions. Evergreen plants like holly, ivy, and pine had symbolic significance representing life continuing through the dead of winter while also serving practical uses as medicine or emergency food. The Church sometimes incorporated pre-Christian plant knowledge into its teachings and celebrations, preserving traditional ecological knowledge within new religious frameworks. Parish priests might bless certain winter plants or include them in religious ceremonies, continuing their cultural importance while adapting their significance to Christian contexts. Winter plant knowledge wasn't just about finding any edible plants, but understanding their nutritional qualities. Medieval people didn't have scientific terminology for vitamins and minerals, but they recognized that certain winter plants helped prevent specific health problems. They observed that people who consumed pine needle tea or rose hip infusions during winter suffered less from bleeding gums and poor wound healing, symptoms of vitamin C deficiency. This practical nutritional knowledge guided foraging priorities during the winter months. Plants known to provide particular health benefits would be specifically sought out when symptoms of deficiency began appearing in community members. This targeted foraging represented a sophisticated understanding of plant properties developed through centuries of careful observation. Winter foraging also contributed to community resilience during times of crisis. When crops failed due to weather or disease, when political instability disrupted normal food supplies, or when other disasters struck, communities with strong winter foraging knowledge had additional resources to draw upon. This knowledge, literally, meant the difference between life and death during Europe's worst famines. Archaeological evidence from medieval village sites shows the importance of wild plants in people's diets, particularly during winter and early spring. Analysis of cooking residues in pottery, plant remains in middens, refuse areas, and even dental calculus from human remains reveals the regular consumption of foraged plants alongside cultivated foods. The practical knowledge of winter plant resources extended beyond food and medicine to other survival needs. Certain winter harvested materials were used for insulation, lighting, waterproofing, or tools. For example, the tinder fungi collected from trees provided not just medicine, but material for starting fires, crucial for winter survival. As spring finally arrived, late winter foraging seamlessly transitioned into early spring gathering. The first tender shoots of nettles, the young leaves of dandelions, and other early growing plants provided a welcome change after months of preserved foods and limited winter forage. These spring tonics, as they were often called, helped bodies recover from winter's nutritional restrictions. The full cycle of the year would continue, with each season offering its distinctive plants and harvesting activities. But the knowledge of what could be found, even in winter's scarcity, remained an essential part of medieval survival wisdom, a testament to how intimately people understood the landscapes they inhabited and depended upon. Winter foraging reminds us that medieval people weren't helpless victims of seasonal scarcity, but active participants in ecological relationships. They combined careful observation, sustainable practices, and communal knowledge sharing to find nourishment and medicine, even when their environment seemed at its most barren. This deep relationship with plants through all seasons, including winter, created communities that could weather hardships by drawing on wild resources beyond their cultivated fields and stored provisions. By maintaining this knowledge across generations, medieval villages developed resilience that helped them survive centuries of climatic shifts, political changes, and economic challenges. As we've explored various aspects of medieval winter survival, from food preservation to clothing, heating, healthcare, community cooperation, lighting, indoor crafts, and forest foraging, we've seen how these elements work together as an integrated system. Each component supported the others, creating a holistic approach to winter that balanced practical techniques with social cooperation and ecological knowledge. The medieval approach to winter wasn't just about enduring the cold months, but about actively preparing for, working with, and even finding value in this challenging season. Their story reminds us that human communities have always found creative ways to meet environmental challenges through knowledge, cooperation, and careful stewardship of the resources available to them.